I don't talk about Beckley much anymore. Not because I've forgotten it, that's the problem. I remember every detail like it happened last night, and some memories are the kind that don't soften with time. They just sit in the back of your mind like a stone you swallowed, too heavy to pass, too deep to reach. But I figure if I tell someone, maybe it'll loosen its grip. Maybe. I'm not counting on it. It was October of 2019. I was driving back from a job site in Fayette County, a remodel on a vacation rental that had gone sideways when we found black mold behind the shower tiles. The client wanted it fixed by Friday, so I'd been working 14-hour days in a respirator, pulling out drywall and hauling debris to a dumpster in the rain. By the time I finished and got on the road, it was already past 11. I should have just slept in the truck. I'd done it before, reclined the seat and pulled my jacket over my face and dealt with the stiff neck in the morning. But I was soaked through and cold, and the heater in my F-150 had been acting up for weeks, blowing lukewarm air that never quite took the chill out. I wanted a hot shower and a bed, that's all. That's the only reason I pulled off Route 19 and followed a hand-painted sign down a 2-lane road toward a motel I'd never heard of. The place didn't have a name I can remember. Maybe it did on the sign, but the rain was coming down so hard that night that the neon vacancy light was just a blurred pink smear through my windshield. The building was a single-story L shape, maybe 16 rooms, with exterior doors that faced a gravel parking lot bordered by a low cinder block wall. Beyond the wall was nothing. Just dark woods pressing up against the property like they were trying to take it back. There were 2 other vehicles in the lot, a sedan with West Virginia plates and a van with no plates at all, parked at an angle near the tree line with its rear windows blacked out. I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to get inside. The office was small, lit by a single fluorescent tube that hummed and flickered every few seconds. There was a counter, a rack of tourist brochures that looked like they hadn't been touched in a decade, and a woman sitting on a stool behind the register. She was maybe 50, thin, with her hair pulled back tight and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She was doing a word search puzzle when I walked in, and she didn't look up right away. I stood there dripping on the tile for a good 10 seconds before she acknowledged me. When she did, it was brief. She asked how many nights. I said 1. She slid a key across the counter, the old-fashioned kind, brass, attached to a diamond-shaped plastic tag with the number 14 stamped into it. Room 14, she said, far end. I reached for the key, and I noticed something. Her hand lingered on it for just a moment, like she was going to pull it back. Her eyes flicked to mine for the first time, and there was something there I couldn't read. Not hostility, not concern exactly. More like she was measuring me, deciding something. Then she let go and looked back down at her puzzle. I drove the truck to the far end of the building and parked in front of the last door. The rain was still hammering, and I made a run for it with my duffel bag over my head. The lock was stiff, and I had to jiggle the key twice before it turned. Inside, the room was what you'd expect. Queen bed with a floral comforter that had seen better days. Particle board nightstand, a television on a low dresser, the old tube kind with a dial. Bathroom to the left with a fiberglass shower stall, and a toilet that ran quietly when you flushed it. Everything looked clean enough on the surface. But there was a smell. I noticed it the second I closed the door behind me. Underneath the sharp chemical tang of industrial cleaner, there was something else. Something warm and metallic, like the air itself was laced with it. I've worked demo jobs in old houses, and I know what copper pipe smells like when it corrodes. That faint, penny-like sharpness that sticks to the back of your throat. This was similar, but heavier. Thicker, like it had been building for a long time in a space with no ventilation. I told myself it was the plumbing. Old building, old pipes, probably copper lines running through the walls that had started to oxidize. I dropped my bag on the bed and went straight for the shower. The water took a while to heat up, but when it did, it felt like salvation. I stood under it until my fingers pruned, then dried off with a towel that smelled faintly of bleach and got into bed. The rain was loud against the window and the roof. A constant white noise that should have put me out in minutes. But something kept me on the edge of sleep, a low-level unease I couldn't pin down. The smell hadn't gone away. If anything, it seemed stronger now that the lights were off, like darkness made it bolder. I finally drifted off around 1, maybe 1:30. And then at some point after 2, I woke up. Not gradually, not gently. My eyes opened, and I was immediately, completely alert, the way you are when your body knows something is wrong before your brain catches up. The rain had eased to a light, steady patter, and underneath it, I could hear something else. A dripping, slow and rhythmic, coming from behind the bathroom wall. Not the faucet, not the shower. This sound was deeper inside the wall itself, behind the tile, behind the drywall. A soft, metered tap, like a leaking pipe hitting something solid at precise intervals. Tap, 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 every 3 or 4 seconds, perfectly spaced. I lay there listening for what felt like 20 minutes. The sound didn't change, didn't speed up or slow down. I told myself to go back to sleep. I told myself it was old plumbing and mountain water pressure and nothing more. But the smell was stronger now. That copper-warm heaviness had filled the room to the point where I could almost taste it, coating the inside of my mouth like I'd been sucking on a handful of change. I got up and walked to the bathroom. The tile floor was cold under my bare feet. I put my ear against the wall behind the toilet, the one that backed up to whatever was on the other side. The dripping was louder here, more defined, and I could feel something I didn't expect. Warmth. The wall was warm. Not hot, not like there was a fire behind it, but warm the way skin is warm, the way a living thing radiates heat when you stand close enough. I pulled my head back. I stared at that wall in the dark, and I felt something I can only describe as a deep, primal wrongness, the kind that starts in your stomach and crawls up your spine. I went back to the bed and turned on the lamp. That's when I noticed the ceiling. Directly above the bed, there was a stain, faint, yellowish brown, with edges that weren't quite dry. It hadn't been there when I checked in. I was sure of it. Or maybe I just hadn't looked up, but it was spreading, slowly, like something was seeping through from above. I watched it for a full minute, and I swear the edge crept another half-inch toward the light fixture. I needed to plug in my phone. The battery was almost dead, and some part of me wanted it charged in case I needed to call someone, though I couldn't have told you who. The only outlet I could see was behind the nightstand, so I grabbed the edge and pulled it away from the wall. It scraped across the carpet, and behind it the wall was exposed. And that's when my hands went cold. The drywall behind the nightstand was covered in scratches. Deep ones, gouged into the plaster with something sharp. Fingernails. They were too ragged and uneven to be anything else. Some of the scratches were just lines, frantic and directionless, like someone clawing in panic. But others were words, names, dates, carved in shaking letters that overlapped and intersected like a fever diary. I leaned closer, my hands trembling, and tried to read them. Some were too faded or too messy to make out, but I could read enough. A woman's name, followed by a date in June. A man's name, November. Another woman, no date, just the name, and then a long scratch trailing off the edge like her hand had been pulled away. And near the bottom, fresher than the rest, carved in letters that were steadier and more deliberate, was a name I didn't recognize and a date from 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks. Someone had been in this room 3 weeks ago and carved their name into the wall behind the furniture. Not as graffiti, not as a joke. The depth of those grooves, the way the plaster had crumbled around them, told me whoever did that was desperate. They were leaving proof they'd been there. A record, a warning. I stood up and looked at the room differently now. The stain on the ceiling was still spreading. The dripping behind the wall hadn't stopped. The smell was so thick I could barely breathe without tasting it. And I understood, not rationally, not in a way I could explain to anyone, but in my gut, in my blood, that I was not safe. Whatever had happened in this room, whatever was behind that wall and above that ceiling, it was not old pipes and water damage. It was something else. And it was patient. I packed my bag in under a minute. I didn't fold anything. I just shoved it all in, and zipped it, and grabbed my keys off the dresser. I left the room key on the bed. I didn't want to walk back to the front office. I didn't want to see that woman again or stand in that flickering light and make small talk about checkout times. I just wanted to leave. But as I stepped outside into the cool, wet air, I made the mistake of looking toward the office. She was there, standing at the window, perfectly still, watching me. The fluorescent light behind her turned her into a silhouette, but I could see enough to know she was facing me directly, and she was smiling. Not a polite smile, not a customer service smile. It was the kind of expression someone wears when they've been waiting for something and it finally happened. Satisfied, almost relieved. I threw my bag in the truck and pulled out of that lot fast enough to send gravel spraying against the cinder block wall. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I drove straight through to Charleston, 3 hours without stopping, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached for 2 days afterward. I tried to find the motel again a few months later, drove that same stretch of Route 19 outside Beckley, and took every turnoff I could find. Nothing, no sign, no L-shaped building, no gravel lot. I even asked at a gas station nearby, and the man behind the counter just shook his head and said there hadn't been a motel on that road in years. The last one closed down in 2014 after something happened that nobody wanted to talk about. He didn't say what. I didn't push. I still think about those names on the wall. I think about the warmth behind the drywall and the stain on the ceiling, and the way that dripping never once changed its rhythm, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to anything alive. I think about the woman's smile and the van with no plates, and the fact that I was the only guest who checked in that night and the only one who checked out. And I think about that name carved 3 weeks before mine, the letters so steady and deliberate, like whoever wrote it had already accepted what was going to happen and just wanted someone, anyone, to know they'd been there before they disappeared. I never went back. I never will. But sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and the rain hits the window a certain way, I hear it again. That slow, patient dripping from somewhere behind the wall. And I lie there in the dark, perfectly still, and I wait for it to stop. It always does, eventually. But every time, it takes a little longer. There are roads in Pocahontas County that don't show up on any map you'd find at a gas station. I know that now. I didn't know it then, back in the fall of 2017, when my buddy Carter and I were driving his old Chevy Blazer through the mountains east of Marlinton on what was supposed to be a weekend hunting trip. We'd been planning it for months, had our tags, had our gear, had a spot picked out on a piece of public land near the Cranberry Wilderness where Carter's dad used to take him when he was a kid. It was supposed to be simple. 2 days in the woods, a cooler full of beer, and nothing to worry about except the weather. That's how it was supposed to go. The transmission had been giving Carter trouble for a couple of weeks. A soft slipping between second and third that he kept saying he'd get looked at when we got back. But halfway up a ridge road with no guardrail and a drop that fell away into pure dark timber, it stopped slipping and started grinding. The Blazer lurched and shuddered, and Carter pulled over onto a gravel shoulder barely wide enough for the truck. He got out and popped the hood and stared at the engine like it might explain itself. The transmission fluid was low, and what was left on the dipstick was dark brown, burnt. We weren't going anywhere fast. No cell signal. No houses in sight. Just the road winding up through hemlock and spruce. The kind of forest that gets so thick the sky disappears. We limped the Blazer back downhill in first gear, nursing it around switchbacks while the transmission whined like a wounded animal. I had my phone out, holding it up near the windshield, watching for even one bar of signal. Nothing. We drove like that for maybe 20 minutes before we came around a bend and saw it. A motel, sitting alone in a clearing on the left side of the road. No town around it, no gas station, no diner. Just the motel in the woods and a hand-painted sign out front that said vacancy in letters that had been white once but had yellowed with age. The building was a long, single-story rectangle, maybe 12 rooms, with exterior doors facing the road. The architecture was pure 1970s. Low-slung with a flat roof and a covered walkway held up by metal poles. The parking lot was cracked asphalt with weeds growing through the seams. There was one light on in the office at the far left end. Everything else was dark. I remember Carter and I sat in the truck for a minute, engine idling, just looking at it. Something about the place felt static, like it had been sitting there unchanged for decades, untouched by anything that happened in the world beyond those mountains. Carter killed the engine, and we walked to the office. The door had a little brass bell above it that jingled when we pushed it open. Inside was a wood-paneled room, about the size of a closet, with a counter, a pegboard of keys on the wall behind it, and a calendar from 2014 still hanging by the register. The man behind the counter stood up from a chair in the back when we came in. He was tall, late 60s maybe, with deep-set eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same wood as the walls. He didn't smile. He didn't greet us. He just stood there and waited for us to speak. Carter explained about the transmission and asked if we could get a room for the night. The man looked at us for a long moment, then reached behind him and took a key off the pegboard. "Room 9, he said. His voice was low and measured, every word placed with precision, like a man who had learned a long time ago to say only what was necessary. He told us checkout was at 6 in the morning, not 6:15, not 6:30. 6. Carter started to laugh, the kind of nervous chuckle you let out when something seems oddly rigid. But the man's expression didn't change. He held Carter's eyes and repeated it. 6 in the morning. You'll want to be gone by then. Carter stopped laughing. We paid in cash and took the key. Room 9 was exactly what you'd expect from the outside. Wood-paneled walls the color of dark honey. Orange shag carpet that was matted flat in the high-traffic areas. 2 double beds with brown plaid bedspreads. A television bolted to the dresser with a bicycle chain and a padlock, like someone expected guests to steal a 30-year-old tube TV. The bathroom had a stand-up shower with a plastic curtain that had gone opaque with soap scum. Everything smelled like dust and old cigarettes and something else underneath, something faintly chemical, like mothballs or formaldehyde, the kind of smell you associate with preservation. We dropped our bags and Carter tried the television. It got 2 channels, both static with the ghost of a signal buried somewhere in the snow. He gave up, and we sat on our respective beds and ate granola bars from the truck and talked about the transmission and whether we could get a tow in the morning. I remember feeling tired but not sleepy, the way you get when your body is exhausted but your mind won't quiet down. Something about the room kept me alert. Maybe it was the silence. Out in the mountains you expect crickets, wind, the occasional owl. But outside that room there was nothing. Just a thick, padded quiet. The kind that feels intentional. Carter fell asleep around midnight. I could hear his breathing go slow and steady from the other bed. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, watching a water stain in the shape of a hand spread across the tiles above me. At some point I must have drifted off, because the next thing I was aware of was the sound of footsteps. I opened my eyes and the room was pitch black. The digital clock on the nightstand said 3:12. The footsteps were outside, on the concrete walkway in front of our door. Not the quick, purposeful stride of someone heading to their room. These were slow, deliberate, one step every 2 or 3 seconds. And then they stopped, right outside our door. I held my breath. In the gap between the bottom of the door and the concrete threshold, I could see a shadow, 2 feet, standing close together, perfectly still, not shifting weight, not adjusting, just standing there. I don't know how to explain the feeling that came over me, except to say it was the purest fear I've ever felt. Not the startled fear of a loud noise, or the anxious fear of a close call on the highway. This was older than that, deeper. It was the kind of fear that lives in the base of your brain, the part that remembers what it was like to be prey. I watched that shadow for 10 minutes. I counted in my head, 600 seconds of 2 feet standing motionless on the other side of a hollow core door. And then, without warning, they moved. 1 step, then another, slow, measured, continuing down the walkway. And I heard them stop again, at the next door. Room 10. The same pause, the same silence. I could almost feel whoever it was standing there, facing the door, breathing. I reached over and shook Carter's arm. He woke up fast, probably because my grip was too tight. I whispered what was happening, and he went still. We both lay there listening as the footsteps moved from room 10 to room 11. The same pattern. Walk, stop, stand, wait, then move to the next door. Carter whispered that it was probably a night manager doing rounds, checking locks or something. But I'd heard the footsteps clearly. They were barefoot, the soft, fleshy sound of bare skin on cold concrete, nothing like boots or shoes. And there was something else. When the footsteps had been outside our door, I'd pressed my ear close to the gap and heard breathing. Not normal breathing. It was shallow and rapid, almost a panting, but with a strange regularity to it that didn't sound like exertion. It sounded like excitement. We didn't sleep after that. We lay in the dark and listened as the footsteps completed their circuit down the row and then went silent. I kept watching the gap under the door, expecting the shadow to come back. It didn't, but the quiet that followed was worse. It had a weight to it, like the air pressure in the room had changed. At 5:30, I couldn't take it anymore. I told Carter we should pack up and get out before 6, before whatever checkout meant at this place. He didn't argue. We stuffed everything into our bags in the dark. I remember my hands were shaking and I kept dropping things. Carter checked his phone for signal, still nothing, and then he stopped and looked at me. He said, "Do you hear that?" I listened. From somewhere outside, muffled but distinct, I heard a sound I can't fully explain. It was mechanical, a series of metallic clicks in rapid succession, like a row of locks being turned by the same key at the same time. And then, one by one, every door in that row opened. Not slammed, not thrown wide. They just clicked and swung inward a few inches each, all of them, simultaneously. I could hear it travel down the building like a wave. Click, 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 click. Each latch releasing in sequence so fast it was almost unison. Carter grabbed his bag and I grabbed mine and we went out the door into the gray pre-dawn light. The walkway was empty. Every door in the row stood open about 4 inches. Dark rooms gaping behind them like mouths. No lights, no sound. No one standing in any of the doorways. Just open doors and silence. And then I looked at the parking lot and my stomach dropped. When we'd arrived the night before, the lot had been empty. Our Blazer was the only vehicle. But now, there were 4 other cars parked in a perfect row beside ours. A sedan, a pickup, a station wagon, and a minivan. All of them older models. All of them had their engines off. And every single windshield was fogged from the inside. Thick condensation coating the glass like the interiors were warm and humid, like something had been breathing in each of them for hours. I walked past the sedan on the way to the Blazer, and I slowed down without meaning to. Through the fog on the driver's window, I could see a shape in the front seat. Not clearly, just a dark outline, roughly the size and proportions of a person, sitting perfectly still, facing forward. Carter grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the truck. We threw our bags in the back and he turned the key. The transmission groaned and the engine caught, and he put it in reverse, and we backed out of that lot without looking at those cars again. The Blazer shuddered and whined, but it moved. We drove in first gear for 6 miles down that ridge road without speaking. When we finally hit a state route and got a cell signal, Carter pulled over and we sat there for a long time. Neither of us called a tow truck. Neither of us said anything about what had happened. We just sat there breathing and watching the sun come up through the trees. Carter got the transmission fixed the following week at a shop in Elkins. The mechanic asked where we'd been driving and Carter told him the road near Marlinton. The mechanic got quiet and asked which road specifically. Carter described it. The ridge, the switchbacks, the clearing with the motel. The mechanic shook his head and said there was no motel on that road. Said there used to be one, years ago, but it closed after something happened with the owner. He wouldn't say what. Just said folks in the area knew to stay off that road after dark and left it at that. I've looked for that motel twice since then. Drove the same road in daylight both times. There's a clearing where I think it was. The asphalt is still there, cracked and overgrown, and if you look closely, you can see the outline of a foundation in the weeds. But the building is gone. The sign is gone. There's nothing there but the clearing and the trees and the sound of the wind moving through the spruce. Carter and I don't talk about that night. We tried once, a few months after it happened, over beers at his place. But every time one of us started to describe a detail, the other one would go quiet, and eventually, we just stopped. There are some things that sound wrong when you say them out loud, not because they didn't happen, but because the words aren't built to hold that kind of weight. All I know is that something stood outside our door at 3 in the morning and breathed like it was savoring the moment. Something opened every door in that building at the same time, and something was sitting in those cars in the parking lot, fogging the glass with its breath, waiting for us to come outside. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't left before 6, and I don't want to know. Some doors, once they open, don't let you walk back through. I took a job in Harlan County in the spring of 2021 because I needed the money and because I was trying to put distance between myself and a situation back home that had gone sour in ways I don't need to get into. A buddy of mine ran a small crew doing electrical work on a string of rental properties that a developer from Lexington had bought up cheap, old coal country houses he was planning to flip into vacation cabins for out-of-state money. The work wasn't glamorous. rewiring panel boxes, running new conduit through crawl spaces that hadn't been opened in 40 years, replacing outlets that still had cloth insulation crumbling off the leads. But it paid weekly, and it kept my hands busy, and that was enough. The job site was about 15 miles outside of Harlan proper, up in a hollow where the road turned to gravel, and the houses sat far apart, with nothing between them but rusted fence lines and overgrown pasture. The crew was staying at a motel closer to town, a place one of the guys had found online. I didn't book with them. I had my own truck and preferred to keep to myself after hours, so I searched for the cheapest option I could find within a 20-minute drive of the site. That's how I found the Ridge Rest. It had exactly one review on the booking site, 3 stars, no text, no photos. The listing showed a nightly rate, so low I assumed it was a mistake. I booked it anyway. When I pulled in that first evening after work, I understood the price. The Ridge Rest was a squat, single-story building set back from a county road on a plot of land that looked like it had been carved out of the hillside with a dozer and never properly graded. The lot was packed dirt. The building was painted cinder block, 8 or 9 rooms in a row, with a small office attached to the left end. Behind the building, maybe 30 feet from the back wall, the tree line started. Not a gradual transition, just a hard edge where the cleared ground ended and the forest began. A wall of poplar and oak and undergrowth so dense it looked like a curtain someone had drawn across the back of the property. The man at the front desk was old, not elderly in the frail sense, but deeply old in the way that mountain people sometimes are, where the years seem to have compressed into the lines of the face and the slowness of the hands. He moved like someone underwater. He took my ID, looked at it for a long time, wrote something in a ledger that sat open on the counter, and handed me a key. "Room 6, he said, around back. I asked if there was anything facing the road instead, and he shook his head without looking up. "Room 6 is what's open," he said, and that was the end of the conversation. Room 6 was at the back of the building, the last door on the right. Its single window faced the tree line. Inside, the room was small but surprisingly clean. The bed was made with tight hospital corners. The carpet was worn but vacuumed. The bathroom had fresh towels folded on the edge of the sink. It smelled like lemon cleaner and something fainter underneath. Not unpleasant, just present, like the ghost of someone's soap or shampoo lingering in the humidity of a room that didn't get enough ventilation. But something about the room felt wrong from the moment I set my bag down. Not wrong in a way I could point to. It was more like a feeling, a subtle awareness that the space I'd walked into wasn't entirely empty. The air had a quality to it, a density, like the room was already occupied and I was the intruder. I tried to shake it off. I was tired. I was in a strange place. I was projecting. But then I started noticing the details. The second pillow on the bed had an impression in it. Not the kind left by factory packaging or a maid fluffing it into shape. A head-shaped dent, deep and settled, the way a pillow looks after someone has been sleeping on it for hours. I pressed my hand into it, and the foam was slow to spring back, like it had been compressed for a long time. On the nightstand, next to the lamp, there was a faint ring on the wood surface, the kind left by a coffee cup or a glass set down without a coaster. The ring was fresh. I could still see the slight moisture in the grain. And in the drawer of the nightstand, when I pulled it open looking for a TV remote, I found a pen and a receipt from a gas station in Evarts. The receipt was dated 3 weeks earlier. I almost let it go. People leave things behind in motel rooms all the time. But something pulled me toward the closet. It was a shallow alcove, with a metal rod and a few wire hangers, and on the shelf above the rod there was an extra blanket folded in plastic. I reached up to check behind the blanket, and my hand touched something solid. I pulled it forward and found a pair of boots. Work boots, men's, size 10 or 11, with red clay dried into the soles and the leather cracked and softened from years of wear. They were tucked behind the blanket deliberately, not tossed or forgotten, but placed, and beneath them, folded with the kind of care you give to something that matters, was a flannel shirt. Green and black plaid, pearl snap buttons, a breast pocket with a faint rectangular outline where a pack of cigarettes had been carried for so long it left a permanent mark in the fabric. The shirt smelled like wood smoke and sweat and something else, something earthy and human that made my throat tighten. I brought the boots and the shirt to the front desk. The old man was sitting in the same position I'd left him in, hands flat on the counter, eyes on the ledger. I set the items down and told him someone had left personal belongings in room 6 and asked if he wanted to put them in a lost and found or try to contact the previous guest. He looked at the boots. He looked at the shirt. Then he looked at me with an expression I still can't fully read. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't surprise. It was closer to resignation, the look of someone hearing something they'd heard before and wished they hadn't. "Nobody's been in that room for 2 months," he said. His voice was flat, not defensive, just stating a fact the way you'd state the weather. I told him that couldn't be right, that there was a receipt in the nightstand from 3 weeks ago and a pillow that had clearly been slept on. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just looked at me and said, "You can leave them on the counter if you want." Then he went back to his ledger. I put the boots and the shirt on the counter and went back to my room. I locked the door and sat on the bed and tried to talk myself out of the feeling that was building in my chest. A tightness, not quite panic but close. The way you feel when you know something is off, but you can't identify the threat. I told myself it was nothing. Previous guest left some things. The old man's memory was bad. The receipt got stuck in the drawer and housekeeping missed it. Simple explanations for simple things. I showered and got into bed around 10. The window faced the tree line and I'd drawn the curtain, but the fabric was thin and I could see the dark mass of the forest pressing against the glass like a held breath. The room was quiet, too quiet. No highway noise, no other guests. No television bleeding through the walls. Just the faint hum of the mini fridge in the corner and the occasional creak of the building settling. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but I couldn't because the air in the room had changed. It was heavier now, thicker, not stuffy in the way a room gets when the ventilation is poor. This was different. It felt like the room was being shared, like someone was breathing in it besides me. I lay there with my eyes closed and focused on my own breathing and realized I could hear a second rhythm underneath it, barely perceptible, slightly out of sync with mine. An inhale that came a half second after mine, an exhale that lingered a beat longer, as if someone was trying to match my breathing but couldn't quite keep time. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. The room was dark except for a thin line of moonlight at the edge of the curtain. Everything was still. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself the sound was my own heartbeat echoing off the cinder block walls. I rolled onto my side and faced the bathroom door. At 1:14 in the morning, the bathroom light turned on. I know the exact time because I was staring at the digital clock on the nightstand when it happened. There was no flicker, no gradual warming of the bulb. Just a sudden clean line of yellow light that appeared beneath the bathroom door like someone had walked in and flipped the switch. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I lay there on my side and watched that strip of light and waited for something to happen. A sound, a shadow, anything. But there was nothing. Just the light, steady and warm, glowing under the door, as if someone was in there standing at the sink or sitting on the edge of the tub. And then I saw it. A shadow passed across the light, slow and deliberate, moving from left to right, the way a person's legs would look if they were walking from the sink toward the shower. It was there for maybe 2 seconds and then it was gone, and the light stayed on. I pulled the blanket up to my chin like a child, and I didn't move for the rest of the night. I watched that line of light until my eyes burned, and I kept waiting for the shadow to cross again. It didn't. But I could feel something in that room with me. Not watching, exactly. More like existing, coexisting, occupying the same space with a quiet, patient familiarity. The way a person sits in their own living room without needing to announce themselves. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke to gray morning light coming through the curtain and the bathroom light was off. I got up slowly and checked the bathroom. Empty, dry. The towels I'd used the night before were still hanging where I'd left them. Nothing was out of place. I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. And then I looked at the chair beside my bed. The flannel shirt was draped over the back of it, folded neatly, the same green and black plaid, the same pearl snap buttons, the same cigarette pack outline in the breast pocket, but it was folded differently than it had been in the closet. In the closet, it had been folded in thirds, lengthwise, the way you'd fold a shirt to pack it in a bag. Now it was folded in a square, the way someone folds a shirt when they take it off at night and set it on a chair before getting into bed. I checked the closet. The boots were gone. I stood there in that room for a long time, holding the flannel shirt and trying to make sense of what I was feeling. It wasn't terror, it was sadness. A deep, hollow ache that came from somewhere I couldn't name. Whoever had left those boots and that shirt in room 6 hadn't forgotten them. They were still using them, still folding their shirt at night and setting it on the chair, still leaving the impression of their head on the pillow and the ring of their coffee cup on the nightstand. They were still there, going through the motions of a life that had, for reasons I couldn't understand, stopped moving forward but hadn't stopped entirely. I left 2 20s on the front desk counter and walked out without saying a word to the old man. He was sitting in his chair, hands on the ledger, and he didn't look up as I passed. I drove to the job site and worked a full day and didn't tell anyone on the crew what had happened. That night I booked a room at the motel where the rest of the guys were staying, a Holiday Inn Express near the highway, with bright lights and thin walls, and the comforting sound of other people living their lives on the other side of them. I finished the job in Harlan County 2 weeks later and drove home. I've never been back, but sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in my own bed in my own house, I think about room 6 at the Ridge Rest. I think about the boots tucked behind the blanket and the flannel folded on the chair and the shadow that crossed beneath the bathroom door at 1 in the morning. And I wonder about the man who left those things behind. I wonder if he checked out or if he's still there, moving through that room in the dark, folding his shirt, setting down his coffee, pressing his head into the pillow, and breathing just slightly out of rhythm with whoever happens to be sleeping in his bed. I wonder if he knows he's gone. I wonder if it matters. And I wonder, in the quietest, most honest part of myself, whether the old man at the desk knew exactly what was in that room and rented it to me anyway, not out of cruelty, but because some guests check in and never leave, and the only thing you can do is give someone else the key and hope that this time the room lets them go. My Uncle Dale was not a man who scared easily. He'd spent 32 years working road construction through some of the most remote stretches of eastern Kentucky, the kind of hollows and ridge roads where you could work a full season and never see a house that had running water. He'd been in equipment rollovers, had a section of guardrail snap and miss his head by 1.5 feet, once had to walk 9 miles in the dark after a work truck broke down in a hollow so deep the GPS thought he was in a lake. He told those stories the way men like him told all their stories, flat and factual, with a can of beer in his hand and a tone that said this is just what happened and there's nothing more to it. But there was one story he told differently. One place he talked about with a voice that dropped lower and a gaze that drifted past you, like he wasn't really talking to you anymore, but to himself, trying to work through something that still didn't sit right no matter how many times he turned it over. The motel was outside Whitesburg, just off a state route that ran through Letcher County toward the Virginia line. Uncle Dale's crew had stayed there on and off for 2 summers in the early 90s, while they were resurfacing a stretch of road that wound up through the mountains toward Pound Gap. It was the only lodging within 30 miles of the job site that would take a block of rooms at a state contract rate, so the crew didn't have much choice. Dale said the place was fine, nothing special, clean enough, quiet enough, the kind of motel that existed to give people a place to stop and not much else. But every man on that crew, over the course of those 2 summers, eventually asked the same question. What was the deal with the last room on the ground floor? It was at the far end of the building, the very last door in the row, set slightly apart from the others, as if the architect had changed his mind about the spacing and left an extra few feet of wall between it and room 11. There was no number on the door. No brass plate, no painted digit, nothing. Just a blank door, same color as all the others, with a deadbolt and a knob and curtains drawn so tight behind the window that you couldn't see even a hairline of light. Dale said he walked past it every day for weeks and never once saw it open, never saw housekeeping go in, never saw a guest come out. The Do Not Disturb sign wasn't hung on the knob because there was no sign. There was just the door, closed and expressionless, and the faintest sense when you stood near it that the air was cooler there, like the wall itself was exhaling. He said he asked the woman who ran the place about it once, casually, the way you'd ask about anything you were mildly curious about. She changed the subject so fast it was like he'd asked her something obscene, just shut it down. Said the room wasn't in service, and that was that. Dale let it go, but he told me the look on her face stayed with him. It wasn't annoyance. It wasn't the look of someone tired of answering a dumb question. It was fear. The quick, reflexive kind that flashes across a person's face before they can arrange it into something more composed. Dale died in 2019. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless. I drove down from Lexington for the funeral and stayed a few extra days to help my aunt sort through his things. On the drive back, I decided to take the long way, partly because I wasn't ready to go home to an empty apartment, and partly because something in me wanted to see the places Dale had talked about. I'd heard his stories my whole life, and they'd become a kind of mythology to me. The geography of a man I admired. And now that he was gone, I wanted to touch the real places behind the words. I found the motel almost by accident. I was on the state route outside Whitesburg, the same road Dale's crew had worked. And I came around a curve, and there it was on the left side of the road, set back in a clearing with a gravel lot and a sign that had been repainted recently, but still looked like it belonged to another decade. The building was exactly as he'd described it. Single story, maybe 12 rooms. Exterior doors facing the lot. A small office at one end with a window and a light on inside. I pulled in without really thinking about it. It was getting dark and I was tired, and some part of me wanted to sleep in a place that Dale had known, as if proximity to his memory might make the grief a little lighter. The woman at the desk was younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with short hair and reading glasses and the efficient, no-nonsense manner of someone who'd been running the place alone for a long time. She gave me room 7, took my card, and handed me a key without much conversation. I signed the register, and then, before I could stop myself, I asked about the room at the end. I tried to make it sound casual, like a throwaway question. I said something like, "I noticed the last room doesn't have a number. Is that one out of service or something?" Her hand, which had been reaching for something under the counter, went still. She looked up at me and her face did exactly what Dale had described. Something moved behind her eyes, fast and involuntary, and then it was gone, replaced by a careful blankness. "That room's not available," she said. Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. She didn't elaborate. She didn't offer an explanation. She just held my gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then looked back down at her register. I went to room 7 and unpacked. It was a standard motel room, nothing remarkable, a bed and a dresser, and a bathroom with a shower that took 3 minutes to get hot. I ate a sandwich I'd picked up at a gas station and watched the news on a television that was bolted to a swivel mount on the wall. Around 10:30, I turned off the lights and tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about the room. Dale's voice was in my head, the way it dropped when he talked about it, the way his eyes went distant. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was a motel room that was probably out of service for maintenance, maybe water damage or a mold issue, and the woman at the desk was just tired of explaining it to every curious guest who noticed the missing number. But I couldn't sleep, and around 11:30 I decided I wanted a cigarette. I'd been trying to quit for months and had mostly succeeded, but I'd bought a pack at the gas station that afternoon in a moment of grief-fueled weakness, and now it was sitting on the nightstand calling to me. I pulled on my boots and my jacket and stepped outside. The night was cold and clear, and the mountains rose up on both sides of the valley like dark walls against a sky full of stars. The parking lot was quiet. 3 other cars besides mine, all dark, all still. I lit a cigarette and leaned against the wall outside my door and smoked and listened to the silence. And then, without meaning to, I looked down the row toward the end of the building. The door to the last room was open, not wide, not thrown back, just cracked, maybe 2 inches, a narrow gap of absolute darkness between the door and the frame. There was no light inside, no sound, no movement, just that sliver of black, so total and complete it almost looked solid, like the darkness had a texture to it, a depth that went beyond the dimensions of a motel room. I stood there and stared at it. I should have gone back inside, I know that. But there's a thing that happens when you encounter something you've been told about your whole life, something that occupied a specific place in someone else's story, and you see it with your own eyes for the first time. It becomes real in a way that's almost magnetic. I couldn't look away. I took a step toward it, then another. I was maybe 40 feet from the door, smoking my cigarette, walking slowly down the concrete walkway, when I stopped. From inside the room, deep inside, past the threshold in the darkness, and whatever lay beyond it, I heard a sound. A chair, scraping across a hard floor, slow and deliberate. not the accidental scrape of someone bumping furniture in the dark. This was intentional. The sound of a chair being pulled back from a table, or turned, rotated on its legs to face a different direction. Toward the door. Toward me. The cigarette burned my fingers and I didn't feel it. Every nerve in my body was firing at once. The same deep old fear I'd felt as a child when Dale told this story around a campfire, except now it was real and the door was right there, and the sound had come from inside, and whatever had moved that chair knew the door was open, and knew I was standing in the dark, looking in. I went back to my room. I didn't run. I wanted to, but something in me understood that running would be the wrong response, that whatever was behind that door was listening for a reaction, and I didn't want to give it one. I walked at a steady pace back to room 7, and I went inside, and I turned the deadbolt, and I put the chain on, and I sat on the edge of the bed with the lights off, and I didn't move until morning. When the sun came up, I got dressed and walked back down the row. The door was closed. Shut tight, same as every other door in the building, no gap, no crack, nothing to suggest it had ever been open. But on the concrete outside the threshold, there were marks, drag marks, shallow grooves scored into the surface, running in parallel lines from the base of the door outward across the walkway and onto the gravel beyond. They were too wide to be shoe marks and too deliberate to be accidental. Something had been dragged from inside that room toward the tree line. The grooves ran straight across the gravel for about 15 feet and then stopped, just ended, no footprints. No disturbance in the ground beyond that point. Whatever had been dragged either stopped there or was lifted. I checked out without mentioning it. The woman at the desk processed my card and wished me a safe drive and didn't meet my eyes. I sat in my car for a few minutes before pulling out, looking at the building in the rearview mirror, trying to see the end room from that angle. The curtain was drawn. The door was shut. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look in daylight, when the world is rational and doors stay closed and chairs don't move by themselves in empty rooms. I called my aunt that evening from a rest stop on the interstate. We talked about Dale for a while, about the funeral, about the things that still needed to be sorted. And then, near the end of the conversation, I told her I'd stayed at the motel outside Whitesburg. She went quiet. I told her about the room, the open door, the chair, the drag marks. She was silent for a long time, and then she said that Dale had told her something about that room near the end, when the morphine was making him honest in ways he'd never been before. He said the crew lost a man during that second summer, not on the job. A guy named Wardell, who was staying at the motel while his wife sorted out things at home. Wardell was in the room next to the end unit. One morning he didn't show up for work, and when they went to check on him, his room was empty. His truck was still in the lot. His wallet and keys were on the nightstand. But Wardell was gone. They searched the woods behind the property for 2 days and never found a trace. The official report said he walked off, maybe headed for the Virginia line, maybe just disappeared the way people sometimes do in these mountains when life gets too heavy. But Dale told my aunt that the morning Wardell vanished, the door to the end room was standing open for the first time anyone could remember, and by noon, it was shut again. My aunt asked me not to go back there. I told her I wouldn't, and I haven't, but I think about it more than I'd like to admit. I think about that sliver of darkness, and the chair scraping across the floor, and the way the drag marks stopped at the edge of the gravel like whatever left them had simply ceased to exist at that point. And I think about what Dale told me the last time I visited him in the hospital, 3 days before he died, when his voice was barely a whisper and his eyes were looking at something I couldn't see. He grabbed my wrist and pulled me close and said the door was never cracked open unless it wanted someone to come inside. He said it like a warning, but there was something else in his voice, underneath the fear and the morphine and the weight of 30 years of not talking about it. It sounded like guilt, like somewhere deep down, in a place he'd never let anyone see. Dale wondered if he should have gone in, if Wardell was still in there, if all of them were still in there, sitting in the dark, waiting for the door to open one more time. I've driven the Route 23 corridor through the mountains of eastern Kentucky more times than I can count. For about 3 years in my late 20s, I was doing pharmaceutical sales for a regional distributor, covering a territory that stretched from Ashland down to Middlesboro and everything in between. It was lonely work. Long days on 2-lane roads that wound through hollows and coal towns. stopping at clinics and pharmacies and small-town hospitals where the waiting rooms smelled like floor wax and old magazines. Most nights I'd end up at whatever motel was closest to the next morning's first appointment, places with names I'd forget by the following week. Interchangeable rooms with thin walls and parking lots that emptied out by 9. I got used to it. You develop a tolerance for solitude when your living depends on it. You learn to sleep in strange beds and eat gas station food and talk to yourself on dark roads without feeling like you're losing your mind. But there was one night in that stretch of years that broke something in me. Some trust I had in the basic predictability of the world, and I've never fully gotten it back. It was a Thursday in November, 2016. I'd had a long day of calls through Pike County that hadn't gone well. 2 of my accounts had switched distributors, and a third was behind on payments, and the pharmacist had spent 20 minutes telling me about it in a tone that suggested it was somehow my fault. By the time I finished my last stop in Pikeville, it was already dark, and I still had a morning appointment in Prestonsburg, about 30 miles south. I could have driven it that night and found a motel closer to Prestonsburg, but I was exhausted in the way that makes your eyes feel like they're coated in sand. And when I saw the glow of a gas station off the highway about 15 minutes outside of Pikeville, I pulled in. The gas station was one of those independent places that sells everything from motor oil to hunting licenses, with a small convenience store attached, and a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising live bait and prepaid phones. Behind it, set back from the road on a patch of gravel that sloped slightly downhill, was a motel. I use the word loosely. It was more like a long, low building that had been divided into rooms, with a flat roof and exterior doors, and a single bulb above each entrance that cast a weak yellow circle on the concrete walkway. No sign that I could see, no office. The woman who rented me the room was the same woman working the register at the gas station. She took my cash, handed me a key from a drawer beneath the counter, and told me I was in room 4. She didn't ask for ID. She didn't ask how many nights. She just took the money and went back to watching a small television behind the register that was playing what sounded like a televangelist program with the volume turned low. Room 4 was at the middle of the building. The door stuck when I turned the key, and I had to shoulder it open. Inside, the first thing I noticed was the wallpaper. It was a faded floral pattern, roses and vines on a cream background that had yellowed with age, and it was peeling away from the walls in long, curling strips, especially near the ceiling and in the corners where moisture had gotten behind the adhesive. The carpet was dark brown, or had been once, and in the far corner near the bathroom door it had been pulled up entirely, revealing a concrete subfloor stained with something that had dried to a color between rust and black. I stood in the doorway and looked at that stain, and my first instinct was to leave. Something about it was wrong. Not just the color, which was bad enough, but the shape. It had edges that were too defined to be a water stain. It looked like something had pooled there and been left to dry without anyone bothering to clean it up. Or maybe someone had tried to clean it, and this was what remained after the effort. But it was past 11. The next motel was at least 40 minutes down a mountain road with no streetlights, and I was so tired my hands were shaking slightly. So I locked the door, set my bag on the dresser, and sat down on the bed. The mattress was firm, and the sheets were clean, which I took as a small mercy. The bathroom had a toilet, a sink, and a shower stall with a plastic curtain that had gone cloudy with soap buildup. No hot water, just lukewarm at best. I splashed my face, brushed my teeth, turned off the lights, and lay down on top of the covers fully dressed. Sleep came in pieces. I'd drift off for 10 or 15 minutes and then surface again, not quite awake, caught in that thin space between consciousness and dreaming where sounds from the real world bleed into whatever your mind is constructing. The building was not quiet. It creaked and ticked and settled with the kind of constant, low-grade noise that old structures make when the temperature drops, the thermal contraction of wood and metal and concrete all talking to each other in the dark. I told myself that's all it was. I pulled the pillow over my ear and tried again. I don't know exactly when the whispering started. It wasn't a sudden thing, not a sound that jolted me awake with a clear before and after. It crept in. At first I thought it was the wind, finding a gap in the window frame, or maybe a radio bleeding through from an adjacent room. But as I lay there and listened, really listened, I realized it was coming from directly behind me, from inside the wall behind the headboard. And it wasn't wind, it was a voice. Low and continuous, barely above the threshold of hearing, like someone murmuring into a pillow or speaking with their mouth pressed against the other side of the drywall. I couldn't make out words. It had the cadence of speech, the rise and fall of phrases, the rhythm of sentences, but the actual content was lost in the wall. What disturbed me most was that it didn't pause. A person talking would stop to breathe, would hesitate between thoughts, would shift their tone when moving from one idea to the next. This voice did none of that. It just went on and on and on, steady and unbroken, like someone reading aloud from a text they knew by heart, the way a person recites a prayer they've said 10,000 times, until the words become pure sound, without meaning. I lay there for what felt like an hour, telling myself every rational thing I could think of. It's a TV in the next room. It's someone talking in their sleep. It's the pipes. It's the building settling. It's your own blood pulsing in your ear pressed against the pillow. But none of those explanations held up because the sound was too localized, too clearly coming from one specific spot in the wall directly behind the center of the headboard. And it was too consistent, too unbroken in its rhythm, to be anything mechanical or incidental. Someone was in that wall, or on the other side of it, and they were talking. I sat up in bed. The whispering continued. I turned on the lamp on the nightstand and the room flooded with weak amber light. The headboard was a simple wooden frame pushed against the wall, and behind it the floral wallpaper was intact. No gaps, no vents, no obvious opening that would explain the sound. I leaned forward. The whisper grew slightly louder as my head got closer to the wall, confirming what I already knew. It was right there, inches away, separated from me by a layer of drywall and paste and faded roses. I don't know why I did what I did next. Curiosity is too clean a word for it. It was compulsion, the same force that makes you look at an accident on the highway even when you don't want to. The need to know even when knowing will cost you something. I pressed my ear flat against the wall directly above the headboard. The whispering stopped. Instantly, like a switch had been thrown. The silence that followed was so complete it had a physical quality, a vacuum, a held breath. I kept my ear against the wall and listened. Nothing. Just the faint hum of the light bulb and the distant sound of a truck passing on the highway. I was about to pull away when I felt it. Pressure. On the other side of the wall, directly against the spot where my ear was pressed, something pushed back. Not a knock, not a tap, a palm. I could feel the shape of it through the drywall, the flat, wide surface of a hand pressing slowly and firmly against the wall from the other side, matching the position of my ear with terrifying precision. It pressed harder. The drywall flexed slightly, barely perceptibly, but I felt it. The wall bowed toward me by a fraction of an inch, enough to tell me that whatever was pushing from the other side was applying real physical force, and it was warm. I could feel heat radiating through the wall from the palm, a feverish warmth that didn't belong to old plaster and insulation. I pulled back so fast I knocked the lamp off the nightstand. It hit the carpet and the bulb flickered but stayed on, throwing a shaky light across the wall. I sat on the far edge of the bed, as far from the headboard as I could get, and I stared at that wall. The wallpaper was motionless. The surface was flat. There was no indication that anything had happened, but my ear was still warm from the contact, the way your skin stays warm after someone holds their hand close to your face. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the edge of the bed with every light in the room turned on, and I watched the wall and I listened. The whispering didn't come back. The pressure didn't come back. But the room felt different now. The air had a charge to it, a heaviness, like the space between the walls was full of something that had been waiting a long time to be acknowledged, and now that it had been, it was satisfied. Not gone, satisfied. There's a difference. I sat like that until the first gray light of morning came through the curtain. It was barely dawn, maybe 6:15, and the light was thin and blue and cold. I stood up and looked at the room in this new clarity, and that's when I noticed something I'd missed in the dark. The wallpaper behind the headboard was different, not dramatically, not in a way that would jump out at you, but the pattern didn't quite match. The roses were a shade lighter. The cream background was cleaner, less yellowed. It had been repasted recently. Someone had stripped the old wallpaper from that specific section of wall, the 3-foot span directly behind the headboard, and replaced it with new paper that was close enough to pass a casual glance, but not close enough to fool morning light. I should have left. I should have grabbed my bag and walked out the door, and driven to Prestonsburg and never thought about it again. But my hands were already moving. I stepped up to the headboard and pulled it away from the wall. It moved easily, lighter than I expected, and I reached up to the seam where the new wallpaper met the old, and I peeled back the corner. Behind the wallpaper, the drywall was covered in writing. Not pen, not marker. It had been scratched directly into the surface with something sharp. Maybe a nail, maybe a key, maybe a fingernail worn down to the quick. The handwriting was jagged and frantic and small, packed tight, spiraling inward in rows that followed no straight line, curving and overlapping, like someone had been writing in the dark, or writing without looking, or writing without stopping. 2 words. The same 2 words, repeated over and over and over, filling the entire exposed section of wall from the edge of the headboard to the ceiling line. Hundreds of repetitions, some legible, some reduced to scratches where the hand had pressed too hard and torn through the paper surface of the drywall. I read the first 2. My eyes found them before I could decide not to look, and then I stopped. I pressed the wallpaper back against the wall and smoothed it flat with both hands and pushed the headboard back into place. I picked up my bag from the dresser and walked out of the room and pulled the door shut behind me and got in my car and drove south toward Prestonsburg with the radio turned up loud enough to fill every corner of my skull. I'm not going to tell you what the words said. I know that sounds like a cop-out, like I'm withholding the ending to make the story scarier. That's not it. The truth is that the words themselves aren't the point. What mattered was the way they were written, the desperation in every scratch, the repetition that went beyond obsession into something that felt like the last act of a mind trying to hold on to itself. Whoever wrote those words had been in that wall, or against that wall, for long enough to carve them hundreds of times, and the motel had covered them up, pasted new wallpaper over them like you'd paint over a stain, made the room rentable again, put a headboard in front of the evidence, and handed the key to the next person who was too tired to drive any farther. I stopped doing the Eastern Kentucky route a few months later, told my manager I wanted a territory change and took a pay cut to cover the Frankfurt area instead. I never went back to that stretch of road between Pikeville and Prestonsburg. I never tried to find that gas station or that motel. I don't know if it's still there. I don't want to know. But some nights, when the house is quiet and I'm on the edge of sleep, I hear it. That low, unbroken murmur, steady and patient, rising and falling in phrases I almost understand, and I feel the warmth. The flat, deliberate press of a palm against the other side of whatever thin barrier separates this world from whatever is on the other side. And I wonder if she's still in there, still whispering, still waiting for someone to press their ear to the wall and listen long enough to hear what she's been trying to say. This isn't my story. I want to make that clear from the start. This belongs to a man named Greg Hollister, who I've known since we were in junior high together in Bluefield. Greg is not a storyteller. He's not the kind of person who embellishes things or stretches the truth for effect. He's an electrician, has been for 20 years, quiet and methodical, the type of man who speaks in measurements and specifications and doesn't waste words on things that don't matter. When Greg tells you something happened, it happened. That's why this story has stayed with me the way it has. Because Greg told it to me once, sitting on his back porch on a Sunday afternoon in the fall of 2018, and the whole time he was talking, his hands were shaking, not dramatically. Not the way they do in movies, just a fine tremor in his fingers as he held his beer, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you'd known someone for 30 years and had never seen their hands do that before. Greg's mother's brother, his uncle Clifton, died in October of that year. Heart attack at 67, quick, gone before the ambulance made it up the hollow where he lived alone outside Welch. Greg hadn't been close to Clifton in years, the way families in these mountains sometimes drift apart without any single falling out, just distance and time, and the slow erosion of connection. But he went to the funeral out of respect for his mother, who had loved her brother deeply and was too frail by then to make the drive to McDowell County herself. So Greg drove down alone on a Friday morning, attended the service at a small church outside Eager, stayed for the burial and the gathering afterward, and then got in his truck to drive home. He should have left earlier. The gathering ran long the way those things do in small mountain communities. People sitting around folding tables in a church basement eating casseroles and telling stories about a man who would never hear them. By the time Greg extracted himself and got on the road, It was already getting dark. McDowell County is not a place you want to drive at night if you don't know the roads. The hollows are narrow and the curves are blind, and the shoulders drop off into creek beds without warning. Greg had planned to drive straight through to Bluefield, maybe 2 hours in good conditions. But the emotional weight of the day had settled into him the way it does after funerals, that particular exhaustion that's less about the body and more about the soul. He was 20 minutes outside of Iager when he realized he was drifting, not falling asleep exactly, but losing the sharp edge of attention you need on those roads. He decided to stop. The motel appeared around a bend, like something that had been there so long the mountain had grown around it. A single-story building, maybe 10 rooms, with a low-slung roof and a gravel lot and a sign that said motel in block letters without a name attached. The architecture was pure, early 1960s, that optimistic post-war style that believed in clean lines and big windows, and the idea that progress would reach every corner of Appalachia eventually. But time had not been kind to the building. The paint was peeling, the windows were clouded, the gutters sagged under the weight of accumulated leaves. It looked less abandoned than forgotten, like the world had moved on and the motel had simply stayed, existing out of habit rather than purpose. The man at the front desk was sitting in a recliner behind the counter watching a basketball game on a small television with the sound turned almost all the way down. He was heavy and slow-moving and didn't get up when Greg came in. Just reached under the counter and produced a key and told Greg the rate and pointed vaguely down the hallway. "Room 5, he said. "End of the hall on the right." Greg paid cash and took the key and walked down a corridor that smelled like carpet cleaner and something older underneath it. Not rot exactly, but age, the accumulated scent of decades of human passage through a space that was never properly ventilated. Room 5 was small, a double bed, a nightstand, a dresser with a television on it that Greg didn't bother turning on, a bathroom with a shower stall and a toilet, and a sink with a slow drip that tapped against the porcelain at irregular intervals. The carpet was dark green, worn flat in the paths between the bed and the bathroom and the door. The ceiling had a water stain in one corner that had been painted over. It was the kind of room Greg had stayed in 100 times on jobs around the state, unremarkable in every way except one. There were 2 mirrors, one mounted on the wall above the dresser, directly across from the bed, the other mounted on the opposite wall, above the headboard. They were large, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet each, set in plain wooden frames that matched the dark finish of the furniture, and they were positioned so that they faced each other directly, with the bed between them. When Greg sat down on the edge of the mattress and looked at either mirror, he could see himself reflected not once but infinitely, his image bouncing back and forth between the 2 surfaces, each repetition slightly smaller and slightly greener from the tint of the old glass, shrinking away into a corridor of reflections that seemed to extend far deeper than the dimensions of the room should have allowed. Greg said it bothered him immediately. Not in a way he could articulate, not like a logical objection to interior design, but in a deeper, more instinctive way. He said looking into that tunnel of reflections made him feel like he was being watched from very far away by something wearing his own face. He pulled the curtains closed and turned off the overhead light and left only the bathroom light on with the door cracked, enough to keep the room from being completely dark, and he got into bed. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he'd feel a pull, almost gravitational, to open them and look at the mirrors. And every time he did, the reflections were there. His own body lying in the bed repeated endlessly in both directions, fading into the green dark distance of the glass. He told himself it was the funeral, the emotional residue of the day, the weariness, the grief. He told himself mirrors were mirrors, and reflections were physics, and there was nothing in that room that couldn't be explained by angles and light. But something was wrong with the angles. He noticed it around 11:30, when he'd been lying there for almost an hour, unable to keep his eyes closed for more than a few minutes at a time. He was watching his reflection in the mirror above the dresser, the one at the foot of the bed, and he shifted his position, just rolled slightly onto his side, the way you do when you're trying to get comfortable. His reflection moved with him, but the reflection of his reflection, the one behind it, the second iteration, was late. Not by much, maybe half a second. A delay so small it could have been his imagination, a trick of his tired eyes or the bad lighting. But he tested it. He raised his hand. The first reflection raised its hand at the same time. The second reflection, the one deeper in the tunnel, raised its hand a beat after, like it was watching first, deciding, then copying. Greg sat up in bed. He stared at the mirror. The reflection stared back. An infinite line of Greg Hollisters sitting up in an infinite line of beds, in an infinite line of rooms, each one slightly smaller, slightly greener, slightly further away. He watched himself raise his hand again. First reflection, immediate. Second reflection, a pause, then the movement. Third reflection, he couldn't tell. It was too small, too deep in the glass. But the pattern was there. The deeper the reflection, the longer the delay. As if whatever was behind those faces needed more time to process what it was supposed to do, the further it got from the original. He got out of bed and took the towel from the bathroom and draped it over the mirror above the dresser. He tucked the edges behind the frame so it would stay. The towel covered the glass completely, and the tunnel of reflections collapsed. The mirror above the headboard now reflected only the towel and the blank wall behind it. Greg felt something loosen in his chest. He got back in bed. The room felt different, lighter, like a pressure had been relieved. He closed his eyes, and this time, sleep came, heavy and fast, the kind of sudden unconsciousness that claims you when your body finally overrides your mind. He woke up at 4:17 in the morning. He knew the time because he looked at his phone the instant his eyes opened, an old habit from years of early job calls. The room was cold, not the gradual chill of a heater that had shut off, but a sharp, immediate cold, the kind that sits on your skin like water. He was lying on his back, and he was looking up at the mirror above the headboard before he was fully conscious, the way you sometimes orient yourself in a strange room by fixing on the first thing your eyes find. The towel was gone. The mirror above the dresser was uncovered, and the tunnel of reflections was back, stretching away in both directions into that infinite green corridor. But something else had changed. The mirrors had moved, not fallen, not shifted randomly. They had been angled, tilted slightly inward, toward the bed, so that the reflections converged more tightly on the spot where he was lying. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. Before, the tunnel had extended outward in parallel lines. Now it narrowed, focused, like the mirrors were leaning in to get a closer look. Greg found the towel on the floor at the foot of the bed, not crumpled, not bunched up the way it would be if it had fallen. It was folded once, neatly, and placed on the carpet, as if someone had removed it from the mirror with care and set it aside. He didn't go back to sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed and waited for the light to change behind the curtains. When the first gray of morning came, he put on his boots and went to the front desk. The man was still in his recliner, awake or having never gone to sleep, watching a different game on the same small television. Greg told him about the mirrors. He said someone had come into his room and removed the towel and adjusted the angles of the glass. His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight, and the man in the recliner must have heard something in it, because he looked at Greg for a long time before responding. "The mirrors are bolted to the studs," he said. "Same position for 30 years. Nobody adjusted anything." Greg pulled the folded towel from where he'd been carrying it and held it up. He said someone folded this and put it on the floor. The man looked at the towel. He looked at Greg, and then he said something that Greg has repeated to me exactly twice, both times in the same flat, careful voice, like a man reciting something he wishes he'd never heard. "Sometimes the rooms like to keep their eyes open," the man said. "That's all." He turned back to the television and the conversation was over. Greg left the key on the counter and walked out. He drove back to Bluefield in the early morning light, with the windows down despite the cold, needing the air, needing the noise of the wind to fill the silence in his head. He said when he got home he went straight to the bedroom and changed out of the shirt he'd slept in. He'd been wearing a gray Henley, nothing special, something he'd had for years. But when he pulled it over his head, he stopped. The shirt smelled wrong. Not like sweat, not like motel detergent. It smelled like someone else. A different body, a different chemistry, like someone had put it on while he slept and worn it for hours, long enough for their scent to soak into the fabric and overpower his own. He held the shirt at arm's length and looked at it under the bedroom light. There was nothing visible on it. No stains, no marks, just the smell, warm and unfamiliar and deeply, Fundamentally, not his. He threw the shirt away. Not in the laundry, in the trash. Outside, in the bin by the curb. He told me he couldn't explain why he needed it out of the house, only that keeping it felt like keeping a door open that he needed to close. Greg and I don't talk about this anymore. I brought it up once, maybe a year after he told me, and he just shook his head and changed the subject. But I've thought about it more than he probably knows. I've thought about those mirrors angled inward over the bed and the towel folded on the floor and the reflection that moved half a second too late. And I keep coming back to what the man at the front desk said. The rooms like to keep their eyes open, not the mirrors. The rooms, like the building itself, had preferences. Like it was watching through the glass the way you'd watch through a window. And I wonder what it saw when Greg covered that mirror. I wonder if it folded the towel the way you'd gently move someone's hand away from your face. Not aggressively, not angrily, just firmly. The way you'd say, "Don't look away." The way you'd say, "I'm not done with you yet." Greg's hands shook the whole time he told me the story. And mine are shaking now, writing it down. Not because I was there, but because I know Greg. And Greg doesn't lie. And whatever wore his shirt that night left something behind that soap and distance and 2 years of silence still haven't washed out. My wife Rachel and I have been married for 11 years. In that time, we've built a life together that I'm proud of. 2 kids, a house outside of Huntington, steady work, the kind of ordinary existence that doesn't make for interesting conversation at parties but gives you something solid to stand on when the ground shifts. Rachel is the strongest person I know. She grew up in a mining family in Logan County, and she doesn't rattle. I've seen her stare down a copperhead on our back porch without flinching. I've watched her handle a house fire when the kids were small, with a calm so total it bordered on mechanical. She is not a woman who scares easily. And that's why what happened in the fall of 2019 has never left me. Not because of what I saw, though that was bad enough, but because of what it did to her. Because Rachel, who has never in our entire marriage refused to talk about something, will not say a single word about that night. Not to me, not to her sister, not to the therapist she started seeing 6 months later for reasons she told me were unrelated. The one time I tried to bring it up, about a year afterward, she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before and said, "Please don't." And the way she said it, the way her voice flattened out and her eyes went somewhere else entirely, I knew I never would again. We'd been at a wedding in Fayette County. Rachel's college roommate, a woman named Dana, was getting married for the second time at a venue outside Fayetteville, one of those converted barn properties that charge a fortune for string lights and mason jar centerpieces. The ceremony was in the afternoon and the reception went late, the way receptions do when the bar is open and the DJ keeps playing and nobody wants to be the first to leave. We'd planned to drive to Charleston afterward and stay with Rachel's cousin, but by the time we said our goodbyes and walked to the car, it was past midnight and we were both exhausted. Rachel had been on her feet and heels for 8 hours, and I'd had enough beer over the course of the evening that the idea of 2 more hours on mountain roads didn't sit well with either of us. We headed south on a 2-lane road that was supposed to connect to the interstate within 30 miles. The GPS was doing that thing it does in the mountains, recalculating every few minutes as the signal bounced between towers, and at some point it gave up entirely and just showed a gray screen with a spinning wheel. We were on our own. The road wound through the Kanawha Valley along the river. Dense forest on both sides, no streetlights, no houses, just the headlights cutting a tunnel through the dark and the occasional reflective sign marking a curve. Rachel was dozing in the passenger seat with her jacket balled up against the window. I was starting to drift, that dangerous zone where your eyelids get heavy and you jerk awake and promise yourself you'll pull over at the next opportunity. The motel appeared on the right side of the road like something the forest had produced rather than something someone had built. There was no advanced signage, no town around it, just a break in the trees and a gravel lot and a low building with a hand-painted sign that said "Rooms" in white letters on a green board. The sign was lit by a single floodlight mounted on a telephone pole. Beyond the lot, the trees closed in again like curtains being drawn. I pulled in and the gravel crunched under the tires loud enough to wake Rachel. She blinked at the building through the windshield and said, "Where are we?" I said I didn't know, but I couldn't drive anymore. The office was a small room at the end of the building with a counter and a bell and a calendar on the wall that was 2 years out of date. I rang the bell and waited. After about a minute, A man came through a door behind the counter. He was thin and tall, with deep-set eyes, and a face that looked like it hadn't smiled in a very long time. Not hostile, just absent, the way some people look when they've lived alone so long, their features forget how to arrange themselves for company. He asked what I needed. I said a room for the night. He said $40, cash only. I paid him, and he gave me a key attached to a wooden tag with the number 3 burned into it. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't ask for a name. He pointed to the right and said third door, and that was the entirety of our interaction. The room was small and cold. A double bed with a quilted bedspread that smelled faintly of mothballs. A nightstand with a lamp that worked on the second try. A dresser with nothing on it. A bathroom with a toilet and a stand-up shower, and a bar of soap still in its paper wrapper. The heater was a wall-mounted unit in the corner, the old kind with a metal grate and a dial, and when I turned it on, it rattled and clanked and produced a thin stream of warm air that did almost nothing to cut the chill. The carpet was thin, and the walls were cinder block painted a shade of beige that had gone gray with age. It was a room built for function and nothing else. The absolute minimum a space needed to contain in order to call itself a place to sleep. Rachel noticed the vent almost immediately. She was sitting on the bed taking off her shoes, and she looked up at the wall above the bathroom door and said, "What is that?" I followed her gaze. Near the ceiling, maybe 8 feet up, there was a rectangular grate, about 2 feet wide and a foot tall, the kind of vent you'd see in an older building for air circulation. It was metal, painted the same beige as the wall, with horizontal slats angled downward. Behind the slats there was darkness, not the shallow darkness of a duct that leads to an HVAC system. This was deep. It went back further than it should have, like the vent opened into a space behind the wall that was larger than the room itself. I could feel it when I looked at it, a sense of depth, of volume, the way you can tell the difference between a closet and a hallway even in the dark. Rachel said it felt like something was looking at us through it. She said it in a half-joking way, the tone you use when something makes you uncomfortable but you don't want to be the one who turns it into a thing. I told her she was being paranoid, that it was just a vent, probably connected to some crawl space or attic access that the building used for airflow. I said it with enough confidence that she let it go. She changed out of her dress and into the t-shirt and sweatpants she'd packed in her overnight bag and got into bed. I did the same. We turned off the lamp and lay there in the dark listening to the heater rattle and the wind push against the window. I fell asleep fast. The exhaustion was total, the kind that pulls you under like a current. But Rachel told me later, in the one conversation we had about this before the silence descended, that she didn't sleep at all. She said she lay there on her side, facing the wall, and she could feel it, the vent. She said it was like a presence in the room, a point of attention directed at the back of her head, steady and unblinking. She said she told herself it was nothing, that she was tired and her imagination was filling in details that weren't there. But she couldn't shake it, and at some point, she said, she rolled over and looked up at the vent in the darkness. She didn't scream, she didn't wake me, she just looked. And then she said she lay there for a long time, perfectly still, watching the vent and understanding with a slow, building certainty that the vent was watching her back. I woke up at 3:11. I know the time because I checked my phone, squinting against the brightness of the screen. What woke me was the absence of sound. The heater had stopped rattling, the wind had died. The room was perfectly, completely silent. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your eardrums like altitude. And Rachel was sitting up in bed beside me, straight up, rigid, her back against the headboard, her face tilted toward the ceiling. She wasn't moving, she wasn't breathing, or if she was, it was so shallow I couldn't detect it. She was staring at the vent. I said her name. She didn't respond. I said it again, louder. She lifted one hand and pointed, slowly, deliberately, like she was showing me something she'd been watching for hours and had only now decided to share. I followed her finger to the vent. In the faint light that came through the window, a pale wash of moonlight diffused through thin curtains. I could see the grate. And behind the grate, in the darkness of the space beyond it, something was moving. Not quickly. Not in the startled, jerky way an animal moves when it's discovered. This was slow, measured. A shifting of mass in the dark. A subtle rearrangement of position, like someone who had been sitting in one pose for too long and needed to adjust. I could see the darkness change density behind the slats, a shape that was darker than the dark around it, filling the space behind the grate with a solidity that didn't belong to shadow or empty air. It moved to the left, paused, moved back to the right, settled, and then it was still. I want to be clear about something. I did not see a face. I did not see eyes. I did not see hands gripping the inside of the grate or fingers curling through the slats. What I saw was worse than that, in a way that's hard to explain. I saw intention. I saw something that had positioned itself behind that vent with purpose, that had been there, watching, for God knows how long, and was now adjusting its angle the way a person adjusts binoculars, finding focus, getting comfortable. The movement wasn't panicked or predatory. It was patient. It had the unhurried quality of something that had done this many times before and saw no reason to rush. Rachel's hand was still raised, pointing. I reached over and took it and pulled it down gently. Her fingers were ice cold and stiff, and she didn't resist, but she didn't help either. Her eyes never left the vent. I leaned close to her ear and whispered that we needed to leave. Now. She nodded, one small dip of her chin. She didn't say a word. I got out of bed as quietly as I could. Every instinct told me not to make noise, not to draw attention to what we were doing, as if whatever was behind that grate might react if it realized we were leaving. I pulled on my shoes without tying them. I picked up Rachel's bag and mine. Rachel swung her legs out of bed and stood up and slipped her feet into her shoes, and the entire time her eyes kept drifting back to the vent. I grabbed her arm and steered her toward the door, and then I stopped. The door was maybe 6 feet from the vent. To leave through it, we would have to walk directly beneath the grate, close enough to reach up and touch it. And beyond the door was the walkway, and beyond the walkway was the office, and the man behind the counter, and the only path to the parking lot. Something about that route felt wrong, not inconvenient, dangerous. The idea of walking past that office, past that man, in the middle of the night with our bags felt like walking deeper into something rather than out of it. I can't explain that feeling rationally. It was instinct. The same kind that makes you cross the street before you consciously register why the person behind you doesn't feel right. The window. The room had one window on the back wall, opposite the door. It was a slider, the old aluminum kind with a latch. I walked to it and flipped the latch and pulled. It stuck. I pulled harder and it shrieked in its track. A high, metallic scream that split the silence of the room. I froze. Behind me, from the direction of the vent, I heard something I will never forget. A sound that was almost but not quite breathing. A long, slow exhale, like air being released from a space that had been sealed. Not mechanical, not wind through ductwork. It was organic, it was alive. And it came from directly behind the grate, close, as if whatever was in there had pressed itself against the slats at the sound of the window opening. I yanked the window the rest of the way open and helped Rachel through it. She moved without hesitation, swung her legs over the sill, and dropped the 3 feet to the ground outside. I threw our bags out after her and climbed through myself. The back of the building faced the tree line, maybe 20 feet of unmowed grass between the wall and the woods. The air was cold and sharp and smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke. We circled the building at a half run, staying close to the wall, and came around to the parking lot. Our car was where we'd left it. The office light was on. I didn't look at the window. I didn't want to see if the man was in there. I didn't want to see if he was watching. We got in the car and I started the engine and pulled out of that lot onto the 2-lane road and I drove. I drove fast, faster than I should have on those curves in the dark, and I didn't slow down until we hit the interstate 25 minutes later. Rachel sat in the passenger seat the entire time without speaking. Her hands were folded in her lap and her eyes were fixed straight ahead, and she didn't look at me and she didn't cry and she didn't try to process it out loud the way we usually process things together. She was somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't reach. We drove to Charleston in complete silence. We got to her cousin's house around 5 in the morning and let ourselves in with the spare key and went straight to the guest room and lay down on the bed fully clothed and didn't sleep. At some point, Rachel reached over and took my hand and held it tight, but she didn't say anything, and neither did I. In the morning, we ate breakfast with her cousin and made small talk and drove home. We picked up the kids from Rachel's mother's house and resumed our lives, and neither of us mentioned what happened. Days passed, then weeks. The silence around it calcified into something solid, a wall we'd both built without discussing it, And behind that wall, the memory sat untouched and unexamined. I thought about it every day. I'm sure she did too. But we never spoke about it. I tried once. About a year later, on a night when the kids were at sleepovers and we were sitting on the back porch with a bottle of wine. I thought the setting was right, thought maybe with enough distance the words would come easier. I said something gentle, something about that night in the valley, and Rachel put her glass down and looked at me and said, "Please don't." Her voice was quiet and steady, but her eyes had that flatness in them, that faraway quality, and I understood. She wasn't refusing to talk about it because she was scared. She was refusing because talking about it would make it real in a way that silence didn't. As long as we never named it, never described it, never gave it the shape and weight of words, it could remain in that room in the Kanawha Valley, behind a grate on a wall in a motel that doesn't show up on any GPS. And maybe it would stay there. And maybe, if we were quiet enough, it would forget about us, the way we were trying to forget about it. I haven't brought it up since. I won't. Some things between a husband and wife are not secrets but agreements, understandings reached without negotiation, and ours is this. We don't talk about the vent. We don't talk about what was behind it. We don't drive through the Kanawha Valley anymore, and when the kids ask why we take the long way to Fayetteville, we say we prefer the scenery. And on the nights when I wake up at 3 in the morning and Rachel is already awake beside me, lying still with her eyes open and her breath shallow, I don't ask what she's thinking about. I already know. And the kindest thing I can do is lie there in the dark with her and say nothing and wait for it to pass. I need to say this up front so you understand where I'm coming from. I am not a superstitious person. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in curses or omens or premonitions. I'm an engineer by training, structural, worked 15 years for a firm in Charleston before going independent. My life is built on math and physics and the absolute certainty that the world operates according to rules that don't bend for anyone. I'm telling you this because what happened to me in Mingo County in September of 2020 doesn't fit inside any framework I've ever trusted, and I need you to know that I've tried. I've spent 4 years trying to make it fit. It doesn't. And the older I get, the less convinced I am that it ever will. The camping trip was supposed to be a reset. My marriage had ended 6 months earlier, not dramatically, just the slow, quiet collapse that happens when two people stop turning toward each other and start turning away. Courtney moved to Morgantown with the kids, and I stayed in the house in South Charleston and rattled around in it like a coin in a coffee can. My therapist, a decent man named Dr. Alderman who had the patience of a saint, suggested I spend some time outdoors. Said it would help me reconnect with myself, whatever that meant. So I loaded my truck with a tent and a sleeping bag and a cooler, and drove south with no particular destination, just a vague idea that I'd find a spot in the mountains and sit with myself for a few days and see what happened. What happened was rain. 3 solid days of it, starting the morning after I set up camp on a piece of public land outside Gilbert. The kind of rain that turns dirt roads into creeks and makes your tent sag inward until the fabric touches your face when you lie down. By the 3rd afternoon, I was soaked through. My gear was soaked through, and the creek that had been 50 feet from my campsite was now roughly 12 feet from my campsite and rising. I packed up and drove out while I still could, fishtailing through mud ruts with the wipers on high and the defrost blasting, looking for somewhere dry to spend the night. Mingo County is not a place with a lot of options after dark. The towns are small and spread thin along the valley floors, and once you get off the main roads, the infrastructure drops away fast. I was on a county road that followed a creek through a narrow holler when I saw the motel. Calling it a motel is generous. It was a single-story cinder block building, maybe 8 rooms in a row, with a flat tar roof and a parking area of packed dirt that had turned to mud in the rain. No sign out front, no name on the building, just a small window at the far left end, with a light on behind it that I took to be the office. The building sat at the edge of the holler with the road in front and the tree line behind, close enough that the branches of the nearest oaks hung over the roofline like fingers reaching for something on the other side. I parked and walked to the lit window. There was a door beside it with a small bell mounted above the frame that rang when I pushed it open. Inside was a room barely bigger than a closet, with a counter, a space heater glowing orange on the floor, and a wooden stool. On the counter was a ledger, the old-fashioned kind with a marbled cover and lined pages, and a jar of pens. Behind the counter, standing with his back against the wall, was the man who ran the place. He was maybe 60, wiry, with the kind of face you see in old photographs of coal miners, all angles and shadow, the fat stripped away by years of something, labor or poverty or both. He was polite, said good evening, asked if I needed a room. But the whole time he was talking to me, his eyes kept moving to the window behind me, scanning the parking lot and the tree line beyond it with a regularity that felt practiced. Not nervous exactly, vigilant, like a man who had learned to watch for something and couldn't stop even when there was no immediate reason to. He stood with his shoulders against the cinder block wall, and he never once stepped forward or turned his back to the room. I noticed it the way you notice someone carrying a concealed weapon. You don't see the object, but you see the awareness of it in the way they move. He told me the rate. I paid cash. He pointed to the ledger and asked me to sign in. I picked up a pen and found the next blank line and wrote my name. Full name, the way you do on formal documents, because the columns were labeled name and date and room, and it felt like the kind of place that expected formality. I wrote my first name, my middle initial, and my last name, in the handwriting I've had since college, a tight, slightly forward-leaning print that my ex-wife used to say looked like an architect's lettering. Then I wrote the date and the room number he'd given me, room 5. And as I set the pen down, my eyes drifted up the page. Just habit, the way you glance at the entries above yours in a sign-in sheet, idle curiosity, nothing deliberate. The page was nearly full, maybe 15 entries above mine, spanning what looked like 2 or 3 months based on the dates. Most of the names were unremarkable, common Appalachian surnames, the Hatfields and Justices and Maynards that populate every phone book in southern West Virginia. But 3 lines above mine, dated 2 weeks earlier, was a name that made my vision narrow to a point. It was my name, my full name. First, middle initial, last. Written in handwriting that I would have sworn under oath was my own. The same tight forward lean, the same way I cross my T's with a slight upward stroke. The same cramped A that my mother used to tell me looked like it was trying to hide. It wasn't similar, it wasn't close. It was identical, as if I had stood at this counter 2 weeks ago and signed this book and then forgotten about it entirely. I stared at it. I read it again. I read it a third time, letter by letter, comparing it to the entry I'd just written 3 lines below. The match was so precise, it looked like a photocopy. The only difference was the date, September 3rd, 2 weeks before my entry on September 17th, and the room number. The earlier entry was room 5, the same room I'd just been assigned. I looked up at the man. He was watching me, not the window, not the parking lot, me. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were steady, and there was something in them I couldn't identify, something that might have been recognition or might have been resignation. I pointed to the entry and asked him about it. I said, "That's my name. Someone wrote my name in this book 2 weeks ago." He reached over and flipped the ledger shut with one hand, a quick, definitive motion, like closing a door on a conversation. "People pass through more than once sometimes," he said. His voice was flat, no inflection, no curiosity. The tone of a man delivering a line he'd said before. I told him I'd never been here before. I said it clearly, looking him in the eye. He picked the ledger up and put it on a shelf behind him, out of reach, and handed me the key to room 5. "You'll want to get some rest," he said. "It's supposed to rain through morning." And that was that. He turned his attention back to the window, and I stood there for a moment, waiting for something more, some explanation or acknowledgement that what I'd just seen was unusual. But he was done with me. His eyes were back on the tree line and his shoulders were back against the wall, and I was holding a key to a room where someone with my name and my handwriting had slept 2 weeks before. Room 5 was the same as every other room. I could see through the identical doors along the row. Cinder block walls painted a flat white that had yellowed. A double bed with a green bedspread, a nightstand, a lamp, a bathroom with a shower stall and a toilet and a sink with a drip. The carpet was indoor-outdoor, the kind you'd put on a porch, laid directly over concrete. There was a window facing the tree line with a curtain that didn't quite close all the way, leaving a 2-inch gap of black glass that reflected the room back at me. The heater was a baseboard unit that clicked when I turned it on, and produced a thin warmth that took the edge off but didn't eliminate the cold that seemed to live in the cinder block itself. I set my bag on the bed and sat down and tried to think rationally. Coincidence. That was the obvious answer. There are other people with my name. Not common, but not impossible. And handwriting can look similar, especially the kind of generic block print that a lot of men my age use. Maybe someone with the same name had passed through 2 weeks earlier, and the similarity was just that, a coincidence amplified by my tired mind and the strangeness of the setting. I almost convinced myself. I sat there on the bed and worked through it logically, and arrived at a conclusion that satisfied the rational part of my brain. But the rest of me wasn't satisfied. The rest of me was doing something I'd never experienced before. A low-grade alarm that sat in my chest like a vibration. Not panic, not fear exactly, but a deep unease that wouldn't resolve. I couldn't stop seeing the handwriting. The crossed T, the cramped A, the forward lean that was mine, uniquely mine, the product of 20 years of muscle memory. No one else writes like that. Your handwriting is as individual as your fingerprint. Dr. Alderman told me that once, in a session about identity and self-knowledge. Your handwriting is yours, he said. Nobody else in the world makes the same marks. I couldn't sleep. I lay on the bed with the lamp on and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain on the flat roof and the baseboard heater clicking and my own breathing. Around midnight, I got up and started looking through the room. I don't know what I was looking for. Evidence, I suppose, though evidence of what I couldn't have said. I checked the nightstand drawer. Empty. I checked the dresser drawers. Empty. I checked the bathroom, the medicine cabinet behind the mirror, the shelf above the toilet. Nothing. I pulled the curtain aside and looked at the window frame for marks or writing. Nothing. And then, almost as an afterthought, I lifted the edge of the mattress. It was between the mattress and the box spring, near the head of the bed, as if it had been placed there deliberately rather than lost or forgotten. A receipt. Small, thermal printed, the kind that fades if you leave it in sunlight. It was from a gas station, a place called Jeb's One Stop, and the address put it about 40 miles north, on Route 52 near Williamson. The date on the receipt was September 3rd, the same date as the guest log entry. The items purchased were a medium coffee, black, and a pack of Camel Turkish Royals. I sat on the edge of the bed and held that receipt in both hands and felt something inside me go very cold and very still. Camel Turkish Royals. That's what I smoke. That's what I've smoked for 8 years. A brand so specific that most gas stations don't carry it, and I usually have to ask for it by name or buy it online. It's not Marlboro. It's not Newport. It's an oddball choice that I picked up from a coworker years ago and never switched away from. Medium coffee, black, is what I order every single morning of my life. No cream, no sugar, black. The same order I'd placed at a gas station that morning before the rain started, 40 miles south of Jeb's One Stop, in a different county. Someone had stayed in this room 2 weeks before me. They had signed the guest log with my name in my handwriting. They had been assigned the same room, and they had purchased, 40 miles up the road, the exact same items I buy every day, the same coffee and the same obscure brand of cigarettes, as if they were living my routine in a place I'd never been. I put the receipt in my wallet. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd need proof later. Maybe I thought that if I took it with me, it would become evidence rather than a hallucination, something tangible that I could hold up and say, this is real, this happened. I didn't imagine it. I put it in the billfold behind my driver's license, and I zipped my bag and I sat in the chair by the window and I waited for morning. The rain stopped around 4. The silence that followed was enormous, the kind of quiet that only exists in places where there's nothing for miles to make a sound. No traffic, no dogs, no distant television. Just the dripping of water off the roof and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the baseboard heater cooling down. I watched the tree line through the gap in the curtain. The trees were black against a sky that was just beginning to lighten at the edges. Nothing moved. But I watched anyway, because the man at the desk watched, and now I understood why. Not what he was watching for, but the feeling behind it. The need to keep your eyes on the place where the known world ended and something else began. I left at first light. Walked to the office and slid the key under the door because I didn't want another conversation with the man behind the counter. Didn't want to see his face or his eyes or the way he stood with his back to the wall. I got in my truck and pulled out of that mud lot and drove north toward Charleston, and I didn't stop until I was back in my own driveway in South Charleston with the garage door closed behind me. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table and took the receipt out of my wallet and smoothed it flat on the surface. September 3rd. Jeb's One Stop, medium coffee, black. Camel Turkish Royals. I stared at it until the thermal ink seemed to pulse under the kitchen light. Then I opened my laptop and searched for Jeb's one stop on Route 52. It existed. It was a real place, a small independent gas station outside Williamson with a Google listing and 2 reviews, both complaining about the bathroom. I called the number listed. A woman answered. I asked if they sold Camel Turkish Royals. She said they did, that they stocked them special for a regular who came through every couple of weeks. I asked what the regular looked like. She paused. Then she described me. Not exactly, not perfectly, but close enough. A man about my height, about my build, drove a truck similar to mine, kept to himself, paid cash. I hung up and sat there for a long time. The house was quiet. Courtney's absence filled every room like a gas, invisible and total. I thought about calling Dr. Alderman. I thought about calling the police, though I had no idea what I'd report. I thought about driving to Williamson and sitting in the parking lot of Jeb's One Stop and waiting to see who showed up to buy my coffee and my cigarettes. I didn't do any of those things. I folded the receipt and put it back in my wallet and I went to bed. But I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and I thought about the guest log and the handwriting and the room and the man who stood with his back to the wall watching the trees. And I thought about the version of me that had passed through that motel 2 weeks before I did, following a route I hadn't planned yet, buying the things I buy, signing my name in my hand, sleeping in the bed I would sleep in, moving through the world 2 weeks ahead of me like a draft of a letter that gets written before the author sits down to write it. I still have the receipt. It's faded now, almost unreadable, the thermal ink giving way to blank white paper the way those receipts always do. In another year it'll be gone entirely, and the only proof I have will be my own memory and the entry in a guest log at a motel in Mingo County that may or may not still exist. I haven't gone back to check. I'm afraid of what I'd find. Not that the motel would be gone, the way it always is in these stories. I'm afraid it would still be there, and I'm afraid the ledger would be open on the counter. And I'm afraid that somewhere on the page, in handwriting that matches mine down to the last stroke, my name would appear again, dated 2 weeks from now, in a room I haven't booked yet, in a place I haven't decided to go. And the man behind the counter would look at me with those flat, unsurprised eyes and say people pass through more than once sometimes. And this time I'd understand what he meant. I was working as a home health aide in the fall of 2022, covering a circuit of clients across 3 counties in southern West Virginia. It wasn't a job I'd planned on. I'd been laid off from a warehouse outside of Madison earlier that year when the company downsized, and the home health agency was hiring immediately with minimal qualifications. They gave me 2 days of training, a stack of intake forms, and a list of addresses scattered across Boone, Raleigh, and Kanawha counties. Most of my clients were elderly, living alone in houses that time had forgotten, and my job was to check their vitals, help with medications, make sure they were eating and bathing and not falling downstairs. It was quiet work, intimate in a way I wasn't prepared for, and it required a lot of driving on roads that didn't always cooperate with modern vehicles or modern expectations of cell coverage. The Boone County clients were the furthest from my apartment in Charleston, almost 2 hours on a good day, and my schedule usually put me there on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If the visits ran late or the weather turned, I'd sometimes stay overnight rather than drive back through the mountains in the dark. I kept a packed bag in the trunk for those nights and had a short list of cheap motels I'd rotate through depending on which direction I was heading. The one in Boone County was a place I'd stayed at twice before without incident. It sat on a road that followed the Coal River through a valley that narrowed as it went deeper into the county, with forested ridges rising on both sides like walls. The motel was small, maybe 10 rooms, with a gravel lot and a front office that doubled as a convenience counter selling snacks and sodas, and the kind of personal items travelers forget to pack. The woman who ran it was quiet and efficient and never made small talk, which I appreciated after a day of being inside other people's lives. I pulled in around dusk on a Thursday in late October. The sky was that deep, bruised purple it turns in the mountains when the sun drops behind the ridgeline, but the light hasn't fully committed to leaving. There were 2 other cars in the lot, a silver sedan near the office and a dark-colored pickup truck parked in front of one of the rooms closer to the middle of the row. I checked in, got room 8, and drove down to my end of the building. Room 8 was near the far right, second from the end, with a window facing the lot and a door that opened onto the concrete walkway. As I was getting my bag out of the trunk, I heard voices. They were coming from room 6, 2 doors down from mine. A man and a woman, talking in low, steady tones, behind the thin curtain that covered the window. I couldn't hear what they were saying, just the murmur of conversation, the cadence of two people going back and forth the way couples do at the end of a long day. There was nothing unusual about it. It was comforting, actually, the domestic normalcy of two people talking in a motel room at dusk. I carried my bag inside and closed the door and didn't think about it again. I showered, ate a sandwich I'd packed that morning, and watched the news on the television for about an hour. The reception was poor, the picture rolling every few minutes, and eventually I turned it off and read a paperback I'd been carrying in my bag for weeks. The room was quiet. The building was quiet. The only sound was the occasional creak of the structure settling, and the faint hiss of the baseboard heater near the window, and the voices from room 6. I noticed them again around 9:30, when I put the book down and turned off the lamp to try to sleep. In the silence of the dark room, the voices were more audible, coming through the wall as a continuous, low murmur. Still a man and a woman. Still the same measured, steady rhythm. They hadn't raised their voices. They hadn't laughed. They hadn't paused. In the 3.5 hours since I'd first heard them, the conversation hadn't changed in tone or tempo. It was the same flat, even exchange, word after word after word, without any of the natural variations that real conversation has. No interruptions. No silences where someone gathers their thoughts. No shift from one topic to another. Just a constant, unbroken stream of sound that rose and fell with the cadence of speech but never deviated from its pattern. I lay in bed and listened. At first it was just background noise, no different from a television left on in an adjacent room. But as the minutes passed and the voices continued without interruption, something began to bother me. I couldn't make out any words. Not a single one. I was lying maybe 15 feet from room 6 with nothing between us but 2 layers of cinder block and whatever thin insulation had been stuffed between them. I could hear the pitch of the voices clearly. I could hear the rhythm of the syllables. I could hear what sounded like sentences, with beginnings and endings, and the slight tonal shifts that indicate questions or statements. But when I focused on individual words, tried to isolate even one, the sounds dissolved into something shapeless. It was like listening to a language I almost recognized, close enough to English to fool the ear at a distance, but fundamentally wrong when you tried to parse it. I told myself they were speaking quietly and the wall was muffling the specifics. I told myself they might be speaking another language, something Eastern European or Asian, something my ear wasn't trained to decode. I told myself a lot of things in the hour that followed, but none of them explained the relentlessness of it. No couple talks for 4 straight hours without stopping. No conversation maintains the same volume and rhythm for that long. People get tired. People get up to use the bathroom. People trail off and pick up and change the subject and fall into comfortable silences. These voices did none of that. They just went on and on and on. By midnight, I was fully awake and sitting up in bed with the lamp on. The voices hadn't stopped. I pressed my ear against the wall that separated my room from room 7, which separated me from room 6. The sound was clearer there, louder, and for a moment, I thought I caught a word. Something that sounded like a name, 2 syllables, spoken by the woman's voice. But when I held my breath and listened harder, it slipped away, blending back into the undifferentiated murmur like a fish disappearing under the surface of dark water. I pulled my ear away from the wall and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor and tried to understand why my heart was beating so fast. It was the continuity. That's what was getting to me. Not the voices themselves, which were calm and steady, but the absolute absence of interruption. By my count, the conversation had been going for at least 5 hours without a single break. Not a cough. Not a clearing of the throat. Not a moment where one voice stopped and the room went quiet before the other picked up. They overlapped seamlessly, trading back and forth with a precision that felt mechanical, like 2 tracks on a recording that had been layered together and set on loop. Around 1 in the morning, I got out of bed and went to the window. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out at the walkway and the row of doors. The parking lot was dark. The 2 other cars were where they'd been when I checked in. Room 6's door was closed and the curtain was drawn, but I could see a faint blue glow at the edges. the kind of light a television casts. The voices were coming from in there. I could hear them more clearly from the window, carried on the cold night air, and they sounded exactly the same as they had through the wall. Same volume, same rhythm, same impenetrable not quite language. I stood at the window for 10 minutes, arguing with myself. Part of me wanted to walk down there and knock on the door and ask them to keep it down, just to have an excuse to see who was in there. Part of me wanted to get in my car and drive back to Charleston and never come back. And part of me, the part that made the worst decisions that night, wanted to go outside and look through the gap in the curtain, just to see, just to confirm that there were two people in that room having a conversation, and that everything was normal and I was being ridiculous. At 2 in the morning, I put on my shoes and my jacket and stepped outside. The air was sharp and cold, the kind of late October cold that smells like dead leaves and wood smoke and the first suggestion of winter. The walkway was concrete, cracked in places, and my footsteps sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. I walked slowly toward room 6, staying close to the wall, and the voices grew louder with each step. Still talking, still steady, still incomprehensible. I stopped in front of the window. The curtain was parted. Not much, just an inch or two at one edge where the fabric didn't quite meet the window frame. The blue light from inside flickered and shifted the way television light does, casting moving shadows on the glass. I leaned in and looked through the gap. The room was empty, completely, unmistakably empty. The bed was made, the spread pulled tight across the mattress, with the kind of precision that only housekeeping achieves. There were no bags on the floor, no clothes on the chair, no shoes by the door, no toiletries on the bathroom counter, which I could see through the open bathroom door. The television was on, tuned to static, a blue-gray field of electronic snow that provided the light I'd seen from outside. And the voices were coming from the television, or near it, or around it. I couldn't tell. They filled the room with the same low, steady murmur I'd been hearing for hours, but there was no one there to produce them. The room was empty, and the conversation was happening anyway. Two voices exchanging words that weren't words in a room where no one had checked in. I stood at that window for almost a minute. I know because I counted the seconds in my head, a habit I developed in training for this job, timing client vitals. 60 seconds of standing in the cold dark, staring into an empty motel room, listening to two voices talk about nothing in a language that didn't exist. And in that minute, something shifted inside me. The fear I'd been carrying all night, the low-grade anxiety that had kept me awake and pressed my ear to the wall and drawn me outside in the middle of the night, transformed into something else. Something quieter and deeper. Not fear, but recognition. The understanding that what I was witnessing was not meant for me. That this conversation, whatever it was, had been going on long before I checked in and would continue long after I left. That the room was not empty at all. It was full of something I couldn't see. Something that had worn a groove in the air with its repetition, the way water wears a groove in stone, and the voices were the residue of that wearing, the echo of something that had happened here so many times it had become permanent. The television turned off. Not gradually, not with a fade. The screen went black in an instant, like someone had pulled the plug, and the blue light vanished and the room plunged into darkness. And the voices stopped, at exactly the same moment, not one trailing off before the other. Both voices, the man and the woman, cutting off mid-syllable, mid-word. At the precise instant the screen went dark. The synchronization was perfect, inhuman, as if the voices and the television had been running on the same current and someone had thrown a single switch. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. It pressed against my eardrums like a change in altitude. I stood there at the window, leaning forward, my breath visible in the cold air, staring into the dark room, waiting for something. And then I heard it, an exhale. Long, slow, deliberate, not a sigh, not a breath released in relief or exhaustion. It was the sound of something that had been holding perfectly still for a very long time, finally allowing itself to breathe. It came from behind me, not from inside the room, not from the walls or the vent or the roof, from directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt the warmth of it on the back of my neck. Close enough that whatever made the sound was standing inches from me in the dark walkway between the building and the parking lot. I didn't turn around. I want you to understand that. I didn't turn around. Not because I was frozen or paralyzed, though my legs had gone rigid and my hands were shaking against the window frame. I didn't turn around because I knew, with a certainty that bypassed every rational system in my brain and went straight to the oldest, deepest part of me, that turning around would mean seeing something, and seeing it would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would mean being part of whatever this was, being drawn into the loop, becoming one of the voices that played on repeat in an empty room for the next person to hear through the wall. I walked back to my room, steady steps, eyes forward. I went inside and locked the door and put the chain on and sat in the chair furthest from the wall that bordered room 6. I sat there until the sky lightened. The voices didn't come back. The silence held, thick and unbroken, for the rest of the night. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It sat in the room with me like a third presence, patient and unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. I checked out at first light. The woman at the front desk was already there, standing behind the counter with a cup of coffee, same as she'd been every other time I'd stayed. I set the key on the counter and asked her, as casually as I could manage, who was in room 6. She looked at me for a moment, then checked a ledger that was open in front of her. Room 6 hasn't been occupied in over a month, she said. We keep it locked. I asked why. She closed the ledger and set her coffee down and looked at me with an expression that told me she'd had this conversation before and didn't enjoy it. Plumbing issues, she said, but her eyes said something different. Her eyes said, don't ask me that again. I drove home to Charleston, and I didn't go back to that motel. I rearranged my Boone County schedule, so the visits ended early enough to make the drive home before dark. My supervisor asked why, and I told her the motel had closed, which was a lie, but it was easier than the truth. The truth was that I could still hear the voices, not literally, not in a way that a doctor would call auditory hallucination, but in the quiet moments, late at night in my apartment, when the building settles and the traffic fades and there's nothing between me and silence, I hear the shape of them, the rhythm, the rise and fall of something that sounds like conversation but carries no meaning. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I hear the exhale, that long, slow breath from somewhere just behind me in the dark. And I lie perfectly still and I don't turn around. Because some things stand behind you in the silence, not because they want to hurt you, but because they want you to look. And looking is how they get in. And once they're in, you become one of the voices, playing on a loop in an empty room, waiting for the next person to press their ear to the wall and listen. I've thought about starting this story a dozen different ways and none of them feel right. There's no clean entry point. No logical place to begin that doesn't sound like I'm building towards something I already know the ending of. But I'll start where it started for me, which was a Tuesday in late October of 2023, on a 2-lane road in Buchanan County, Virginia, about 12 miles outside of Grundy, in a fog so thick my headlights turned it into a white wall that moved with me like something alive. I was driving south from a job interview in Bluefield that I was fairly certain I hadn't gotten. Software quality assurance for a medical billing company, the kind of work I'd been doing in one form or another for a decade, sitting in fluorescent-lit rooms testing interfaces that would be obsolete before the fiscal year ended. The interview had been perfunctory. The hiring manager spent most of it looking at his phone. I shook his hand on the way out and drove south instead of north, not toward home in Roanoke, but deeper into the mountains, because I didn't want to go back to my apartment and sit in the silence and calculate how many more weeks of savings I had before things got difficult. Sometimes driving is the only therapy that works. You put the road in front of you and you follow it, and the motion itself becomes a kind of thinking, a way of processing that doesn't require words. The fog came on around 4 in the afternoon, which was early even for October in the mountains. One minute the road was clear, and the next I was driving through cloud cover that had settled into the valleys and hollows like water filling a basin. I slowed to 30, then 20. The road was narrow, no center line, no guardrail, just crumbling asphalt and a shoulder that dropped off into what I assumed was a creek bed or a ravine, but couldn't see through the white. I should have stopped. I should have pulled over and waited it out. But the fog felt like it was thickening rather than lifting, and I didn't want to be parked on the shoulder of a blind road in conditions where someone could rear-end me before they saw my taillights. The motel materialized out of the fog the way things do in that kind of weather, not gradually but all at once, emerging from the white wall as if someone had placed it there in the seconds before I rounded the curve. It was a single-story building on a ridge, set back from the road on a gravel flat that had been cut into the hillside. Behind it, the mountain continued upward into timber and fog. In front of it, the road dropped away toward a valley I couldn't see. There was a sign, hand-lettered, that said "Vacancy" in red paint on white wood. One other vehicle in the lot, an older model SUV with Virginia plates, parked near the office end. The building had maybe 8 rooms, exterior doors, a covered walkway with metal support poles. Standard mountain motel architecture, built to be functional and nothing else. The office was a cramped room with wood-paneled walls, and a counter and a rack of brochures for caverns and state parks that were at least 100 miles away. The man behind the counter was young, younger than I expected, maybe mid-20s, with a beard and a flannel shirt, and the distracted, slightly anxious energy of someone who had inherited a business he didn't entirely want. He gave me room 3, took my card, and told me there was a vending machine at the end of the walkway if I needed anything. He didn't mention breakfast. He didn't mention checkout time. He just handed me the key and went back to whatever he'd been doing on the laptop that was open on the counter behind him. Room 3 was clean. I want to be specific about that because people assume that what happened to me was preceded by obvious warning signs. A filthy room, a strange smell, something overtly wrong that I should have heeded. There was nothing like that. The bed was made, the carpet was vacuumed, the bathroom was scrubbed and the towels were fresh and the soap was wrapped in paper. It was a perfectly adequate motel room, but it felt wrong. I noticed it the moment I closed the door behind me and set my bag on the bed. The air was heavier than it should have been. Not humid, not warm, just dense, as if the room contained more atmosphere than its dimensions warranted. Like walking into a space where too many people have been breathing for too long without opening a window, except there was no staleness to it, no smell, just weight. I told myself it was the fog. Barometric pressure does strange things in the mountains, and maybe the low-lying cloud cover was compressing the air or altering the humidity in a way that my body could feel, but my mind couldn't categorize. I unpacked my charger and my toothbrush and plugged my phone in beside the nightstand. That's when I found it. The nightstand was one of those cheap particle board units, a flat top with a single drawer and a lamp bolted to the surface. It was pushed close to the wall but not flush, leaving a gap of maybe 2 inches between the back of the nightstand and the cinder block. My charger cable fell into that gap when I was trying to plug it into the outlet behind the stand, and when I reached down to retrieve it, my fingers touched something that wasn't cable, something flat and smooth with a case on it. I pulled it out and found myself holding a cell phone. It was an Android, a Samsung of some kind, in a black rubber case that was cracked along one edge. The screen had a spiderweb fracture radiating from the upper left corner, the kind of damage you get from a drop onto concrete. I pressed the power button and the screen lit up. 12% battery, no lock screen, no passcode, just a home screen with the default wallpaper and a row of app icons along the bottom. I should have taken it to the front desk. That's what a normal person does when they find a phone in a motel room. You turn it in, and someone puts it in a lost and found box. And eventually the owner calls looking for it, or they don't, and it sits there until someone throws it away. That's what I should have done, but I didn't. And I've asked myself why 100 times since then, and the honest answer is that I was bored and lonely and unemployed and sitting in a motel room in the fog with nothing to do, and the phone was right there in my hand, already unlocked, already lit up, already offering itself to me like a window into someone else's life. Curiosity is not an excuse, but it's the truth. I opened the phone. No notifications, no recent calls, no text messages, not a single one, which struck me as odd. Everyone has text messages. Even if you clear them regularly, there's usually something, a delivery notification, a 2-factor code, a message from a parent or a friend. This phone had nothing. It had been wiped clean of everything except the default apps and one thing, the camera roll. I opened the photos. There were maybe 40 of them, time-stamped over what appeared to be a single day. The earliest ones were from the morning, time-stamped around 8 a.m., and they were the kind of photos anyone takes on a road trip through the mountains. A wide shot of a valley with fog in the hollows, a gas station with an old-fashioned pump and a hand-painted price sign, a road sign marking the county line into Buchanan. They were competent but unremarkable, the work of someone documenting a drive without any particular artistic ambition. The light was flat and gray, the kind of overcast sky that makes everything look like a memory of itself. Then the photos changed. Around photo 15 or 16, the subject shifted from the landscape to an interior. A motel room, my motel room, room 3. I recognized the bedspread immediately, a dark blue quilted cover with a subtle diamond pattern. I recognized the nightstand and the lamp, and the carpet and the curtain. The photos showed the room from different angles, systematic, almost methodical, like someone cataloging the space. One of the bed from the foot, one of the bathroom door, open, showing the sink and mirror. One of the closet, empty, the sliding door pulled aside. One of the ceiling above the bed, showing the textured plaster and the light fixture, and, in the upper right corner, the rectangular grate of a ventilation duct. Each photo was taken from a position that felt deliberate, not artistic but analytical, documenting. I sat on the edge of the bed and scrolled through them slowly. My hands were steady, but something in my chest had gone tight. A clenching sensation that I associated with the moment before bad news, the pause between a phone ringing and the voice on the other end saying something you can't take back. The photos continued. The room, the room, the room. The same space from 8 or 9 different vantage points. Each one slightly different, each one adding another angle to a composite image that was building towards something I could feel but couldn't yet see. And then I reached the last 14 photos and I understood. They were all of the bed, taken from directly above, looking straight down, as if the camera had been pressed against the ceiling. The angle was impossible for a person standing on the floor. Even if you held the phone above your head at full arm's reach, the perspective wouldn't be this vertical, this centered. The lens was pointing straight down at the mattress from what must have been less than a foot below the ceiling, and the image filled the frame with the bed and nothing else. The bedspread, the pillows, and a person. Someone was lying in the bed, on their back, covers pulled up to their chest, head on the pillow, face visible in the blue-gray darkness of a room, with the curtains drawn and no light source, except whatever ambient glow came through the fabric from outside. The face was blurred slightly by the low light and the cracked lens, but I could make out enough. A man, middle-aged, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, asleep. The timestamps on the 14 photos span from 2:07 a.m. to 4:04 a.m. One photo every 9 minutes. I checked. 2:07, 2:16, 2:25, 2:34, perfectly spaced to the minute, as if whoever was taking these photos had set a timer and followed it without deviation. And in every single frame, across almost 2 hours of 9-minute intervals, the man in the bed had not moved, not shifted his arm, not turned his head, not adjusted the covers. The position was identical in every photo, down to the angle of his chin and the placement of his hands, as if he were not sleeping, but arranged, or as if whatever force was keeping him still was absolute. I set the phone down on the bed and stood up. The room felt different now. The heaviness in the air that I'd noticed when I first walked in had a new quality, not just dense but attentive, like the room itself was aware of me and had been aware of me since I arrived. I looked up at the ceiling above the bed. The textured plaster, the light fixture, the ventilation grate in the corner, the same grate I'd seen in one of the earlier photos. It was about 2 feet by 1 foot, with metal slats angled downward, and behind the slats there was darkness. I stared at it for a long time. The slats were too narrow to see through clearly from this angle, but the darkness behind them had a depth to it that I didn't like. It didn't look like the shallow space behind a vent cover. It looked like a space you could fit into. I picked the phone up again and went back to the 14 photos. I zoomed in on the first one, the 2:07 a.m. image. The man's face filled my screen, blurred and blue in the dark, eyes closed, mouth open. And then I noticed something at the very top edge of the frame, a shadow, faint, barely visible against the dark ceiling, but present. A shape that was slightly different in density from the plaster around it. I swiped to the next photo. The shadow was in a slightly different position. I swiped to the next, slightly different again. Across the 14 photos, while the man in the bed remained absolutely motionless, the shadow at the top of the frame shifted incrementally, moving from the left edge toward the center, as if whatever was casting it was slowly adjusting its position above the bed. Getting closer, finding the angle it wanted. The last photo, the 404 image, was different from the others. The shadow was gone, but the composition had changed. The camera was closer to the bed than in any of the previous frames. The man's face was larger, more detailed, and his mouth, which had been slightly open in every other photo, was closed. His lips were pressed together in a thin line that didn't look like sleep. It looked like someone had closed them, like someone had reached down and pressed his lips shut the way you'd close the mouth of a person who had stopped breathing. I put the phone down on the nightstand. I did not place it back in the gap where I'd found it. I set it face down on the surface where it would be visible, where the next person or the cleaning staff or the man at the front desk would find it, and maybe, if they looked at the photos the way I had, understand that something had happened in this room that couldn't be explained by plumbing issues or bad wiring or the fog. I picked up my bag. I hadn't unpacked anything except the charger and the toothbrush. I put them back in the bag and zipped it and put on my jacket and opened the door and walked out into the fog. The air outside was cold and wet and tasted like pine and mineral, and I stood on the walkway and breathed it in and tried to slow my heart rate. The parking lot was dim, lit by a single floodlight on a pole near the office that turned the fog into a glowing white dome. My car was 15 feet away. The fog beyond the lot was impenetrable. I took one step toward the car and stopped. I don't know why I looked up. I had no reason to. But I did. I looked up at the roof line of the building, at the edge where the flat tar roof met the cinder block wall, at the dark line where the structure ended and the sky began. And along that edge, just barely visible in the haze of the floodlight, there was a shape, low and flat, pressed against the roof like something that had crawled up from behind and was lying on its stomach, looking down at the walkway, at me. It was too dark and too foggy to make out details. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see arms or legs or clothing, but I could see the outline, the mass, the suggestion of a human form in a position no human would choose, flat against a tar roof in the cold and the fog, perfectly still, watching. I got in my car. I started the engine. I pulled out of the lot and onto the ridge road, and I drove into the fog, and I did not stop. I drove for 3 hours through visibility that never exceeded 50 feet, white-knuckling the steering wheel through curves I couldn't see the other side of. And I didn't pull over, and I didn't slow down below 30, and I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I drove until the fog thinned and the road widened, and the first lights of a real town appeared on the horizon like a promise that the world was still there. I got a room at a chain hotel off the interstate outside of Wytheville. Fluorescent lobby, plastic key card, ice machine humming in the hallway. I went to my room and locked the door and sat on the bed under lights that were too bright and too white and too beautifully artificial. I didn't sleep. I sat there until morning, and I watched the ceiling above the bed, and I counted the minutes between each time I blinked, making sure the intervals were irregular, making sure nothing about my stillness could be mistaken for the kind of absolute, arranged motionlessness I'd seen in those 14 photographs. I've never gone back to Grundy. I've never tried to find that motel. I don't know who the man in the photos was. I don't know if he checked out the next morning and drove home and lived his life without ever knowing what had been above him in the dark, photographing him every 9 minutes with the patience of something that doesn't experience time the way we do. I don't know if he woke up. The last photo, the one where his mouth was closed and the camera was closer and the shadow was gone, sits in my memory like a locked door I'm afraid to open. Because the shadow being gone doesn't mean whatever cast it had left. It means it had gotten close enough that it no longer cast one. And the mouth being closed doesn't mean he closed it himself. It means someone, something, reached down from directly above him and pressed his lips together in the dark, and then took one final picture, and left the phone wedged behind the nightstand like a souvenir, or a warning, or a record of something it was proud of. I check the ceiling now, every room I stay in, every hotel, every motel, every unfamiliar bed. I look up at the plaster and the light fixture and the vents, and I study the shadows, and I make sure they're mine. And some nights, in the moments before sleep takes me, I feel it. The weight of the air changing above me, the room getting heavier, the sense that something is there, just beyond the boundary of sight, patient and precise, counting the minutes between frames, waiting for me to go still.